morning light came slowly to the tower dormitory, filtering through diamond-paned windows that looked out over grounds still wrapped in early autumn mist. Eleanor Ashby stirred beneath her quilt, a patchwork thing her grandmother had charmed to stay perfectly warm, and for a moment, in that hazy space between sleep and waking, she forgot where she was. Then she heard it, the gentle creak of ancient floorboards, the distant echo of footsteps on stone somewhere far below, and the soft rustle of curtains that moved without any breeze to push them. Memory flooded back in a rush that made her heart quicken. Hogwarts. She was at Hogwarts. Eleanor opened her eyes fully and stared up at the canopy of her four-poster bed. The fabric was a deep burgundy, embroidered with small golden lions that seemed to shift positions when she wasn't looking directly at them. Around her, separated by those thick curtains, 4 other girls still slept. She could hear their quiet breathing, the occasional murmur of a dream. Yesterday had been a blur of new faces and overwhelming magic. The sorting hat's scratchy voice in her ear, the burst of applause when it shouted, "Gryffindor!" The dizzying journey up moving staircases to this tower room. She'd fallen asleep almost immediately, exhausted by wonder and nervousness in equal measure. But now, in this gentle morning quiet, she had time to truly feel it. She was here. She was really here. Carefully, Eleanor pushed back her curtains and slipped out of bed. The floor was cold against her bare feet, despite the warmth that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the castle. She padded over to the window and pressed her palm against the glass, watching her breath fog it slightly. The view stole what little breath she had left. From this height, she could see across the grounds, the dark expanse of the forbidden forest to one side, its trees still mysterious in the morning dimness. The lake stretched silver grey in the distance, its surface perfectly still. Closer, the grounds themselves were beginning to emerge from a shadow, and she could just make out the shapes of the greenhouses, their glass panes catching the first real rays of sunlight, first-day nerves. Eleanor jumped and turned. One of her roommates had pulled back her curtains, a girl with dark brown skin and thick curls pulled into a messy bun. She smiled at Eleanor's startled expression. "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you. I'm Priya Candola. We met yesterday, sort of, in all the chaos." "Eleanor?" she said, though Priya clearly already knew that. "And yes, nerves. Same." Priya swung her legs out of bed and stretched. "I barely slept. Kept thinking about classes starting today. My older brother told me not to worry, but he went to Durmstrang. So what does he know about Hogwarts professors?" The mention of classes sent a fresh flutter through Eleanor's stomach. Today wasn't just about settling in anymore. Today, the real work began. Today, she would sit in actual classrooms with actual professors and be expected to perform actual magic, not just the accidental bursts that had marked her childhood. The other girls began to wake as well. Soon, the dormitory filled with the rustle of robes being pulled from trunks, the splash of water in the adjoining bathroom, the nervous chatter of first years trying to remember their schedules. Eleanor dressed carefully in her new uniform, smoothing down the robes and checking her reflection in the long mirror by the door. The girl looking back at her seemed older somehow, more serious, with her Gryffindor tie knotted neatly and her house crest sitting over her heart. She touched the wand in her pocket, 11 inches, ashwood with a unicorn hair core. It had chosen her just 3 weeks ago in Diagon Alley, and she still wasn't entirely sure what to do with it beyond making it light up, which she'd practiced so many times her mother had finally told her to stop before she wore it out. Ready? Priya appeared at her elbow, her own robe slightly askew, but her smile bright with determination. Eleanor took a breath and nodded. Ready. The journey down to breakfast was an adventure in itself. The staircases had seemed magical last night. This morning, they seemed determined to be difficult. Twice the stairs shifted, just as Eleanor stepped onto them, forcing her to grab the banister and redirect her path. Portraits called out greetings or complaints as they passed, and suits of armor creaked ominously in alcoves. Left here, Priya said confidently, then paused. Or was it right? They'd ended up in a dead-end corridor before a prefect found them and kindly redirected them back toward the entrance hall. By the time they finally descended the marble staircase into the vast space with its torches and flagstone floor, Eleanor's nervousness had settled into something more manageable. It was hard to stay anxious when the castle itself seemed so alive, so full of personality and peculiar magic. The great hall was already filling with students. The morning light streamed through the high windows, and the enchanted ceiling above showed a sky just beginning to turn from grey to pale blue, a few wisps of cloud drifting lazily across it. The usual house tables were laden with breakfast, porridge and eggs, toast and bacon, pitchers of pumpkin juice and tea that steamed gently in the cool morning air. Eleanor followed Priya to the Gryffindor table and slid onto the bench, acutely aware of the older students around them. A few second years were already arguing over a Transfiguration essay, their voices carrying over the general breakfast noise. Further down, a group of seventh years sat with their heads bent together, speaking in low, serious tones about NEWTS. Look, Priya whispered, nudging Eleanor and nodding toward the staff table at the front of the hall. The professors sat in a row beneath the high windows, and Eleanor found her gaze drawn to them with a mix of fascination and trepidation. Professor McGonagall sat near the center, her pointed hat perfectly straight, reading what appeared to be the Daily Prophet with an expression of stern concentration. Beside her, a small wizard, Professor Flitwick, Eleanor remembered, was gesturing enthusiastically to the professor on his other side, his voice too quiet to carry, but his excitement evident. At the far end sat Hagrid, the groundskeeper they'd all met briefly yesterday. He was impossible to miss, twice the size of anyone else, his wild hair and beard making him look like some sort of gentle giant from a storybook. He was spreading what looked like an alarming amount of marmalade on a piece of toast the size of a serving platter. "That's Professor Sprout," Priya said, pointing more subtly than Eleanor had been staring. "Head of Hufflepuff. She teaches herbology. We have her this morning, I think." Professor Sprout was a squat witch with flyaway grey hair that looked like it had been styled by the wind. There was something immediately comfortable about her, Eleanor thought. Perhaps it was the dirt Eleanor could see under her fingernails, even from this distance, or the way she smiled at the students as she buttered her bread. Eleanor poured herself some tea, grateful for something to do with her hands. The warm cup felt grounding. Around her, the hall continued to fill, the noise level rising steadily as more students arrived and conversations overlapped. Owls swooped in through the high windows, delivering post and packages with soft hoots and the flutter of wings. A scroll landed beside Eleanor's plate, and she jumped before realizing it was her schedule. She unrolled it with slightly shaky fingers. Monday schedule. First year Gryffindor, 9 o'clock. Herbology, Greenhouse 3. With Hufflepuff, 11 o'clock. Care of Magical Creatures, Hagrid's Paddock. With Hufflepuff, 2 o'clock. Transfiguration, Classroom 1B. With Slytherin, 3 classes. Just 3. She could manage 3 classes. Eleanor read the schedule twice more, committing it to memory, then tucked it into her robes. Herbology first, Priya said, checking her own schedule. At least Professor Sprout looks nice. Nicer than McGonagall anyway, muttered a boy across from them, a fellow Gryffindor whose name Eleanor thought might be Thomas. My brother said she once transfigured a student into a pocket watch for being late. That's not true, said an older student passing behind them. But she did once turn someone's ears into teapot handles. I'd get to Transfiguration on time if I were you. Thomas paled slightly and attacked his porridge with renewed focus. Eleanor tried to eat, but her stomach was performing acrobatics. She managed some toast and a few sips of pumpkin juice, watching as the ceiling above slowly brightened, the enchanted sky keeping perfect pace with the real one outside. It was extraordinary, really. Magic so seamlessly woven into everyday life that the other students barely glanced at it. Would she ever reach that point, she wondered? Would floating candles and moving staircases and enchanted ceilings become ordinary? She hoped not. At 9:15, students began to disperse, heading off to their various first lessons. Eleanor and Priya gathered their things, bags that felt far too light, containing only fresh parchment, quills that Eleanor didn't quite trust not to splatter ink everywhere, and a few textbooks that smelled of new leather and possibility. The walk across the grounds to the greenhouses was its own kind of magic. The morning had fully arrived now, crisp and clear, with dew still sparkling on the grass. The castle rose behind them, vast and impossibly ancient, with its many towers and turrets catching the sunlight. Ahead, the greenhouses stood in a neat row, their glass panels gleaming. Other first years were converging on the same destination. Eleanor recognized the yellow-trimmed robes of Hufflepuff students among them. A girl with strawberry blonde hair in elaborate braids smiled at her as they approached Greenhouse 3. Exciting, isn't it? The Hufflepuff, girl said. I'm Ivy, by the way. Ivy Rosewood to Eleanor Ashby. And yes, terrifying, but exciting. Ivy laughed, a warm sound that made Eleanor smile despite her nerves. My mum teaches at a Muggle primary school, and she always says the first day is hardest for everyone, even the teachers. They reached Greenhouse 3 just as Professor Sprout emerged from inside, her arms full of terracotta pots that she set down on a long workbench with practiced ease. Up close, she was even more maternal-looking than she'd appeared at the staff table, with rosy cheeks and eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled at the gathering students. Good morning, she called cheerfully. First years, yes? Lovely. Come in. Don't be shy. There's plenty of room for everyone, and the plants don't bite. Well, most of them don't bite. A nervous titter ran through the group, but Professor Sprout's smile was so genuinely warm that it was impossible to be too afraid. Eleanor followed the others inside, and the warmth hit her immediately. A humid, earthy warmth that smelled of soil and growing things, and something else, something indefinably magical that made her fingertips tingle. The greenhouse was bigger inside than it looked from outside. lined with benches covered in plants of every description. Some were familiar. She recognized roses and ferns, and something that might have been mint. Others were decidedly not familiar, including one purple plant that appeared to be humming softly to itself. "Find a spot at the benches," Professor Sprout instructed, moving between the rows and straightening plant pots as she went. "Two to a bench, please. We'll be working in pairs for most of our herbology lessons. It's good to have a partner who can help if you accidentally stick your finger in something you shouldn't." Eleanor glanced at Priya, who nodded. They claimed a bench near the middle, where the light was good, but they wouldn't be right under Professor Sprout's eye. The wood was worn smooth by years of students, marked here and there with old scorch marks and stains that might have been plant sap or potion residue. Once everyone was settled, Professor Sprout clapped her dirt-smudged hands together. "Right then, welcome to herbology. I'm Professor Sprout, and for the next several years, I'll be teaching you about the fascinating world of magical plants. Some of what we study will be useful for your other classes. Many plants are essential potion ingredients, for instance. Some of what we learn will simply be useful for life, and some of it," her eyes twinkled, "will just be interesting for interest's sake, which is the best kind of learning in my opinion." She moved to the front bench, where a collection of small pots sat waiting. "Now, we're going to start simple today. No venomous tentaculars for you yet. Instead, we're going to get acquainted with what I consider the foundation of all herbology study, understanding how to listen to what a plant needs." Eleanor leaned forward, her earlier nervousness beginning to transform into something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or the first stirring of genuine interest. Professor Sprout picked up one of the small pots, cradling it gently. "This is Mimbulus, Mimbletonia seedling. Nothing like the mature version, which can be quite aggressive. At this stage, they're gentle creatures, but they still have needs. They still communicate in their way. Your job as a herbologist isn't just to remember facts from a textbook. It's to observe, to pay attention, to care." She looked around at all of them, her expression serious now, but still kind. Magic isn't always about wands and incantations. Sometimes it's about patience, about watching and waiting and noticing small changes. Some of the most powerful magic I've ever witnessed has happened right here, in soil and sunlight. Eleanor found herself nodding. She thought of her grandmother's garden back home, the one normal corner of their otherwise entirely magical household. Her grandmother had always said there was something meditative about gardening, something that quieted the mind. Eleanor had never quite understood before, but now, in this warm greenhouse with the smell of earth and growth all around her, she thought she might be beginning to see it. "Now then," Professor Sprout said, her cheerful tone returning, "everyone is going to receive one of these seedlings. Your task, and this will be your ongoing task for the term, is to keep it alive and help it grow. You'll learn how to read what it needs. You'll make mistakes. That's fine. That's expected. But by the end of term, you should have a healthy young Mimbulus, Mimbletonia, and, more importantly, you should have learned how to truly pay attention to a living magical thing." She began moving between the benches, handing out small pots with seedlings that looked like miniature cabbages, with the faintest hint of grey-green pulsing beneath their surface. When she reached Eleanor and Priya's bench, she set down a pot between them with a gentle smile. One between you two. You'll need to coordinate care, which means communication and compromise, both excellent skills for any witch or wizard. Eleanor stared down at the little plant. It was unremarkable, really. Just a small, slightly ugly seedling in a terracotta pot. But it was hers to care for, hers to keep alive, her first real magical responsibility at Hogwarts. She reached out slowly and touched one of the small leaves. It was cool and slightly damp, and she could have sworn she felt the faintest pulse beneath her fingertip, like a tiny heartbeat. "Hello," she whispered, too quietly for anyone but Priya to hear. "I'll try my best with you." The leaf seemed to lean just slightly into her touch. Professor Sprout was explaining watering schedules and light requirements, her voice a comfortable background to Eleanor's racing thoughts. This was it. This was magic. Not the flashy kind with sparks and bangs, but something quieter, something that required attention and patience and care. Eleanor pulled out a fresh piece of parchment and her quill, determined to take the best notes she possibly could. Her handwriting was careful, neat, each instruction recorded precisely. Beside her, Priya did the same, occasionally asking questions that Professor Sprout answered with obvious delight. The lesson continued, and the morning light grew stronger outside, streaming through the glass panels and making the greenhouse glow. Eleanor found herself relaxing, her shoulders dropping from where they'd been hunched near her ears. The warmth was soothing, Professor Sprout's voice was encouraging, and the work itself, observing the seedling, noting the color of its leaves, learning how to check the soil's moisture, was engaging in a way she hadn't expected. This wasn't frightening. This was nice. When Professor Sprout finally announced that the lesson was drawing to a close, Eleanor was surprised to find that nearly 2 hours had passed. It had felt like minutes. "Your homework," Professor Sprout said, and a collective groan rose from the students, though it was a good-natured one, "is simply to visit your seedling once a day. Check on it. Water it if needed. Write down any observations. We'll discuss what you've noticed at our next lesson." Students began to pack up, chattering about the class, about the seedlings, about the next lesson on their schedules. Eleanor stood slowly, reluctant to leave the warmth of the greenhouse for the cooling autumn air outside. "That wasn't so bad," Priya said, slinging her bag over her shoulder. "Actually, it was kind of lovely." "It was," Eleanor agreed, taking one last look at their small seedling before following Priya toward the door. As they stepped outside, Eleanor glanced back. Professor Sprout was already tending to the other plants, humming softly to herself, completely in her element. There was something reassuring about that, the idea that someone could be so perfectly suited to their calling, so content in their work. Maybe, Eleanor thought, as she and Priya headed back across the grounds toward the castle. Maybe she could find that same sense of belonging here. Maybe Hogwarts would help her discover what she was meant to do, what kind of witch she was meant to be. The castle loomed ahead, ancient and enormous and full of mysteries yet to uncover. 3 more years of exploration stretched before her. 3 more years in this tower dormitory, 3 more years of classes and learning and growth. Her first class was complete. She had survived it. More than survived it. She had enjoyed it. Eleanor touched her wand in her pocket, felt the comfortable weight of her bag on her shoulder, and smiled. The second herbology lesson arrived on a Thursday morning. 4 days after that first gentle introduction to magical plants. Eleanor had visited the greenhouse every evening as instructed, watching their Mimbulus Mimbletonia seedling with the careful attention Professor Sprout had encouraged. Each time, she'd noted small changes in her parchment journal. A new leaf unfurling here, a slight deepening of the grey-green colour there, the way the plant seemed to lean toward whichever direction the afternoon sun was strongest. Priya had been equally diligent, though her notes were considerably more artistic than Eleanor's practical observations. She'd sketched the seedling from multiple angles, adding little arrows and labels in her neat handwriting. Together, they'd developed an easy partnership, discussing their plant's needs over breakfast and checking on it together whenever their schedules aligned. Now, as Eleanor made her way across the dewy morning grounds with Priya and several other Gryffindors, she found herself actually looking forward to the lesson. The early autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of cut grass and something else, perhaps the herbs growing in the beds outside Greenhouse 1. Mist still clung to the lowest parts of the grounds, giving everything a dreamlike quality. "I think ours grew," Priya was saying, animated despite the early hour. "I swear the third leaf is bigger than it was yesterday." "It definitely is," Eleanor agreed. She'd noticed the same thing during her evening visit, had even measured it with her finger to be certain. "Do you think that means we're doing it right?" "I hope so. My mum would never let me hear the end of it if I managed to kill a magical plant in my first week at Hogwarts." They reached Greenhouse 3 to find Professor Sprout already there, as always, her dragon hide gloves on and her hair even more windswept than usual. She was moving between the benches where the first year's seedlings sat in their neat rows, examining each one with the focused attention of someone who could read volumes in the tilt of a leaf or the color of soil. "Good morning. Good morning," she called out cheerfully as students began to file in. The greenhouse was already warm, the heating charms activated early to protect the more delicate plants from the autumn chill. Eleanor felt the familiar wave of humid air, smelled that rich combination of earth and growth and magic that she was beginning to associate with this space. "Find your plants, everyone," Professor Sprout instructed. "Have your observation journals ready. Today we're going to go deeper into the art of magical plant communication." Eleanor and Priya claimed their usual bench, and Eleanor pulled out the parchment journal she'd been keeping. It was already filling up with notes, not just about their seedling, but about everything she was learning. She discovered she enjoyed this kind of careful documentation, the way it helped her process and remember information. Their Mimbulus Mimbletonia sat in its pot exactly where they'd left it, but Eleanor could see immediately that it looked healthier than it had 4 days ago. The leaves were fuller, their color richer. The plant had a vitality to it that hadn't been there before. "Excellent," Professor Sprout said, appearing beside their bench so suddenly that Eleanor jumped. The professor chuckled. "Sorry, dear. Didn't mean to startle you. But look at this. Your seedling is thriving. What have you two been doing?" "Just what you told us," Priya said. "Checking the soil moisture, making sure it gets enough light, talking to it sometimes, talking to it." Professor Sprout's eyes lit up. "Wonderful. Yes, plants respond to attention, to voice, to the simple fact of being noticed. It's not about the words themselves, you understand, but about the intention behind them. Care, properly directed, is its own kind of magic. She moved on to examine other seedlings, offering encouragement here, gentle corrections there. Eleanor watched her work, fascinated by how the professor seemed to know exactly what each plant needed just by looking at it. There was no wand waving involved, no complicated spells, just knowledge and experience and genuine affection for growing things. "Now then," Professor Sprout said once she'd completed her rounds, returning to the front of the greenhouse. "Today we're going to learn about magical plant nutrients and how to properly feed your seedlings. But before we get to the practical portion, I want to talk about something more fundamental." She picked up a watering can from the front bench, an old copper one with a long spout. "Who can tell me what plants need to survive? Basic needs, magical or mundane?" Several hands went up. Professor Sprout nodded at a Hufflepuff boy near the front. "Water, sunlight, and soil," he offered. "Excellent start. Yes, those are the fundamentals. But what else?" She looked around encouragingly. "Don't be shy. There's no wrong answer in herbology, only incomplete observations." "Air?" suggested another student. "Precisely. Plants breathe just as we do. They take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen. A rather convenient arrangement for us animal folk, wouldn't you say?" Her eyes twinkled. "What else?" Eleanor found her hand rising before she quite decided to raise it. Professor Sprout's gaze landed on her warmly. "Miss Ashby." "Nutrients from the soil?" Eleanor said, her voice tentative. "Minerals and things." "Yes, excellent. Nutrients, minerals, trace elements, all crucial for healthy growth. And here's where magical plants get particularly interesting." Professor Sprout set down the watering can and moved to a cabinet at the back of the greenhouse. She returned with a wooden box that looked ancient, its surface worn smooth by countless handlings. "Magical plants," she continued, opening the box to reveal several small cloth bags, "require not just physical nutrients, but magical ones as well. They draw on the ambient magic in their environment, but they can also be fed specific magical compounds that encourage particular types of growth or enhance certain properties." She pulled out one of the bags and loosened its drawstring, tilting it so students could see the glittering powder inside. Even from her bench, Eleanor could see it shimmer. Not quite silver, not quite gold, but something in between. "This is ground moondew crystal, harvested from the Scottish Highlands under a full moon. For plants like your Mimbulus Mimbletonia seedlings, a tiny pinch mixed into their water once a fortnight will strengthen their defensive capabilities and help them grow more robust." Professor Sprout began moving between the benches again, this time distributing small vials to each pair of students. "I'm giving you each a supply that should last the term. The key word here is tiny, everyone. A pinch the size of a nut, no larger. Too much magical fertilizer and you'll overwhelm your plant's natural development. Think of it like seasoning a soup. You can always add more, but you can't take it back once it's in." Eleanor accepted their vial carefully, holding it up to the light. The powder inside sparkled and shifted, and she could feel a faint warmth through the glass, as though it were somehow alive. "Now," Professor Sprout said, returning to the front and picking up the copper watering can again, "let's talk about the actual process of feeding your plants. This isn't just about dumping water and nutrients on them and hoping for the best. There's a method to it, a sort of ritual, if you will." She demonstrated with a mature, Mimbulus Mimbletonia on the front bench, a plant considerably larger than the seedlings, its grey-green surface pulsing gently. First, you check the soil. She pressed a finger into the earth around the plant's base. Not too dry, not waterlogged, just right. Then, if you're adding magical nutrients, you prepare your water. From her pocket, she pulled a small bag similar to the ones she distributed. With careful precision, she pinched out what really was a tiny amount of the glittering powder and dropped it into the watering can. The water inside immediately began to shimmer. "You'll notice the change," she said, tilting the can so students could see. "The water takes on a luminescence. That's how you know the magical compound has activated. Now here's the important part. You don't just pour. You water with intention." Professor Sprout held the can over the plant and began to pour in a slow, steady stream, moving in a clockwise circle around the base. As she did, she spoke quietly. Eleanor couldn't hear the exact words, but the tone was clear. It was gentle, encouraging, almost like a lullaby. The Mimbulus Mimbletonia responded visibly. Its pulsing quickened slightly, and the grey-green color deepened to something richer, more vibrant. A few of the boil-like protrusions on its surface seemed to swell slightly, looking healthier. "You see?" Professor Sprout set down the watering can and stepped back, beaming. "The plant knows it's being cared for. It responds. Now, I'm not saying you need to sing to your seedlings, though you can if you like, but I am saying that the care you put into the process matters. Attention matters. Gentleness matters." She clapped her hands together, and a small puff of soil dust rose from her gloves. "Right. Time for everyone to try. Take your vials. Prepare your water. There are watering cans at each station. And feed your seedlings. Remember, a tiny pinch, clockwise motion, gentle words. I'll be circulating to help." The greenhouse filled with activity. Eleanor carefully measured out water from the large barrel near their bench, filling the small copper can that Priya retrieved from under the work surface. Her hands were shaking slightly as she opened their vial of moondew crystal powder. "Tiny pinch," Priya reminded her, echoing Professor Sprout's words. "Like a nut." Eleanor pinched what she hoped was the right amount between her thumb and forefinger. The powder felt strange, silky and warm and somehow effervescent, as though it were barely contained in its physical form. She dropped it into the water and watched in fascination as the liquid began to glow with that soft, otherworldly luminescence. "Your turn?" Priya asked. "Or should I?" "You do it," Eleanor said. "Your handwriting's prettier. Maybe your watering will be too." Priya laughed, but took the watering can carefully. She held it over their seedling, and Eleanor could see her friend take a deep breath, centering herself. Then slowly, Priya began to pour in a clockwise circle, just as Professor Sprout had demonstrated. "Grow strong," Priya murmured, so quietly Eleanor almost didn't hear. "We're taking care of you. You're safe here." The water soaked into the soil, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, so subtly Eleanor might have imagined it, the seedling seemed to straighten slightly, its leaves perking up just a fraction. The grey-green color of its surface brightened, and Eleanor could swear she felt something in the air change, a small shift in the magical atmosphere of the greenhouse. "Did you feel that?" she whispered to Priya. "I did," Priya breathed, her eyes wide. It's like it said thank you." Professor Sprout appeared at their bench, and her smile was knowing. You felt it respond, didn't you? That's the connection forming. That's what makes herbology more than just gardening. You're not simply growing a plant. You're forming a relationship with a living magical being. It may not think or communicate the way we do, but it's alive, and it knows when it's cared for. She moved on to help a pair of students who'd apparently added too much powder. Their water was glowing so brightly it was almost blinding, but Eleanor stayed focused on their seedling. She reached out and gently touched one of its leaves, feeling that same subtle pulse she'd noticed before, but stronger now, more definite. "Hello," she whispered, just as she had during the first lesson. "We'll keep taking care of you, I promise." The leaf pressed back against her finger, just the smallest amount of pressure, but unmistakable. The lesson continued with Professor Sprout explaining the different types of magical fertilizers, when to use which ones, and how to recognize signs of overfeeding or underfeeding. She pulled out examples of plants that had been cared for incorrectly. Not to shame anyone, she emphasized, but to help them learn what warning signs to watch for. One plant had yellowed leaves from too much water. Another had wilted from insufficient light. A third had a strange crystalline growth on its stem from massive overfeeding with magical nutrients. Professor Sprout explained each problem with patience and humor, making it clear that mistakes were part of the learning process. "I once killed 7 venomous tentaculars in a row when I was training," she admitted cheerfully. "Couldn't work out what I was doing wrong. Turned out I was talking to them too aggressively. They thought I was threatening them, and they went into defensive hibernation. My mentor had to explain that even carnivorous plants respond better to gentle encouragement than harsh commands." The students laughed, and Eleanor felt some of her lingering nervousness ease. If even Professor Sprout, who seemed to know everything about magical plants, had made mistakes and learned from them, then perhaps it was okay that Eleanor didn't know everything yet. Perhaps being uncertain and still learning was exactly where she was supposed to be. As the lesson drew toward its close, Professor Sprout had them practice the watering ritual several more times with plain water. No magical additives. She wanted them to feel comfortable with the motion, with the intention behind it, before they tried it again with actual nutrients. Eleanor took her turn, feeling self-conscious at first about speaking to the plant while others might hear. But when she glanced around, she saw that everyone else was equally absorbed in their own seedlings, murmuring their own quiet words of encouragement. There was something almost meditative about it. The circular motion of the watering, the gentle words, the focused attention on this one small living thing. By the time she finished, her shoulders had dropped again, that familiar relaxation settling over her just as it had during the first lesson. The greenhouse was warm and humid, smelling of rich earth and growing things. Professor Sprout's voice was a comfortable background, offering guidance and praise in equal measure, and their seedling sat in its pot, visibly healthier than when they'd arrived, responding to their care. "Homework," Professor Sprout announced as students began to pack away their things, "is to continue your daily observations. But now you'll also need to research one magical plant of your choice, not the Mimbulus Mimbletonia, something different. Write me 12 inches on its care requirements, magical properties, and any interesting historical uses. Due next Thursday, There was some groaning, but it was half-hearted. Eleanor actually found herself intrigued by the assignment. 12 inches seemed like a lot, but the Hogwarts library was supposed to be extensive, and she'd been wanting an excuse to explore it properly. As the class filed out into the cooling morning air, Eleanor lingered for just a moment, taking one last look at their seedling. It sat on the bench among all the others, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know it. But to Eleanor, it was special. It was hers and Priya's, and it was thriving because they were learning to care for it properly. "Coming?" Priya called from the doorway. "Yes, sorry." Eleanor hurried to catch up, but she glanced back once more. Through the glass panels of the greenhouse, she could see Professor Sprout moving among the plants, already tending to them with that same patient care she brought to everything. The morning sun made the glass glow, turned the whole structure into something luminous and warm. As they walked back toward the castle, Eleanor pulled out her schedule. Care of magical creatures with Hagrid was next, which meant they had about 20 minutes to get there. Plenty of time. "That was nice," Priya said, echoing the sentiment she'd expressed after the first lesson. "I wasn't sure about herbology when I first saw it on my schedule, but I think I might really like it." "Me too," Eleanor agreed. She touched the vial of moondew crystal powder in her pocket. Professor Sprout had told them to keep it safe, that it was precious and not to be wasted. The glass was warm against her palm, and she could feel a faint vibration through it, as though the powder inside were humming with stored magic. They climbed the steps to the entrance hall, passing a group of older Ravenclaws who were arguing about the proper technique for a summoning charm. The castle was fully awake now, alive with students moving between classes, ghosts drifting through walls, portraits calling out comments and observations from their frames. Eleanor thought about what Professor Sprout had said, that care, properly directed, was its own kind of magic. It wasn't the flashy, dramatic magic she'd imagined when she first received her Hogwarts letter. There were no explosions or transformations or dramatic spell effects, but it was magic nonetheless, perhaps even more profound for being so subtle. She thought of their seedlings' leaves pressing back against her finger, that gentle acknowledgement of care received. She thought of Professor Sprout's obvious love for her work, the way the professor seemed to know exactly what each plant needed just by looking at it. She thought of the warm greenhouse, the rich smell of earth, the patience required to watch something grow slowly over weeks and months. Maybe this was what Hogwarts would teach her, not just spells and potions and magical theory, but how to pay attention, how to care for things properly, how to recognize that magic existed in small, quiet moments as much as in grand gestures. "Earth to Eleanor," Priya said, waving a hand in front of her face. They'd reached the stairs that would take them down and out to the grounds again for Hagrid's class. "You were miles away." "Sorry," Eleanor said, smiling. "Just thinking about how much there is to learn here, and how glad I am to be learning it." Priya grinned. "Spoken like a true Gryffindor. Come on, let's see what Hagrid has for us today. Hopefully something that doesn't bite." They headed down the stairs together, their robes swishing, their bags full of notes and new knowledge, and ahead of them, the ground stretched out in morning sunlight, full of possibilities and creatures yet to meet. The day was still unfolding, and Eleanor found herself eager to see what came next. The day was just beginning. The path down to Hagrid's hut wound through grounds that seemed to grow more wild the farther they walked from the castle. The manicured lawns near the building gave way to longer grass studded with wildflowers, and then to rougher terrain where tree roots broke through the earth, and the forest's edge loomed dark and mysterious nearby. Eleanor could hear the forbidden forest even from here, the rustle of leaves, the call of birds that might or might not be ordinary, the sense of something vast and ancient just beyond sight. "There it is," Priya said, pointing ahead to where a wooden hut sat in a small clearing, smoke curling from its chimney despite the mild morning temperature. The hut looked precarious, as though it had been built without much concern for straight lines or symmetry, but there was something charming about it nonetheless. Pumpkins grew in an enormous patch beside it, already swelling to sizes that seemed improbable for early autumn. As they approached, the door burst open and Hagrid emerged, his massive frame filling the entire doorway. He had to duck to avoid hitting his head on the lintel, and even then his wild hair brushed against it. He was wearing a moleskin overcoat that looked like it could house a small family, and his beard was even more tangled than Eleanor remembered from seeing him at the staff table. Right then," he called out in a booming voice that carried across the clearing. "Come along, first years. Don't be shy. Got something special to show you today." Students were gathering in a loose group near the hut, Gryffindors and the Hufflepuffs together, just as they'd been in herbology. Eleanor recognized Ivy Rosewood among the Hufflepuffs, her strawberry blonde braids glinting in the sunlight. Ivy caught her eye and waved enthusiastically. Morning," Hagrid continued, his beetle-black eyes shining with excitement. "Welcome to Care of Magical Creatures. I'm Hagrid, Keeper of Keys and Grounds here at Hogwarts, and I'll be teaching you about some of the most fascinating creatures in the magical world." His enthusiasm was infectious. Even the students who looked nervous, and there were several, Eleanor noticed, seemed to lean forward slightly, caught up in Hagrid's obvious passion for his subject. "Now," Hagrid said, rubbing his enormous hands together, "I know some of ye might have heard stories about dangerous creatures and such, and it's true. Some magical creatures can be dangerous if you don't treat them with proper respect. But that's the key word there. Respect. You treat a creature with respect, understand its nature, and most often, it'll treat you right back." He gestured for them to follow and began walking toward a fenced paddock behind his hut. Eleanor could see movement inside it, something large shifting in the shadows of a makeshift shelter. "First rule of Care of Magical Creatures," Hagrid announced as they walked, "is that every creature's got its own personality. Just like people, you can't treat them all the same and expect good results. Some creatures need gentleness, some need firmness, some need space. The art is in learning to read them, to understand what they're telling you." They reached the paddock fence, and Hagrid turned to face the class, his expression suddenly serious. Second rule: never approach a magical creature without permission from someone who knows it. Never assume you know better. And never, ever turn your back on a creature you don't trust yet. Got it? Everyone nodded, some more vigorously than others. Eleanor felt her heart beating faster. What exactly were they about to meet? Right then, Hagrid said, his grin returning. "Today we're going to meet one of the most magnificent creatures I know. Now, they got a reputation for being proud and dangerous, and that's partly deserved. But when you meet a young one, raised right and treated proper, well, there's nothing quite like it." He moved to the paddock gate and began to unlatch it. "I want everyone to stay calm and quiet. No sudden movements, no loud noises. These creatures are sensitive to respect, or the lack of it. They can sense if you're afraid, but they can also sense if you're genuine." The gate swung open, and Hagrid disappeared inside the paddock. Eleanor heard him making soft clicking sounds, cooing gently at whatever was inside the shelter. Then, slowly, he emerged, leading something that made several students gasp. It was a hippogriff, but not a full-grown one like Eleanor had seen in textbook illustrations. This was a baby, perhaps only a few months old, though baby was relative when the creature still stood nearly as tall as Eleanor herself. It had the head, wings, and front legs of an eagle, covered in soft grey feathers that caught the light like silk. Its back half was that of a horse, with sleek brown fur and delicate hooves that stepped carefully as Hagrid led it forward. "Everyone, meet Silverwing," Hagrid announced proudly. "She's just 4 months old, still very young for a hippogriff. Her mum's one of the herd in the forest, but she let me take this one to socialize with humans while she's still young enough to learn trust." The hippogriff, Silverwing, turned her head to regard the students with one large, startlingly intelligent golden eye. Eleanor felt herself being assessed, evaluated. It was disconcerting, but also thrilling. This was a magical creature, a real one, standing just meters away. "Now," Hagrid said softly, keeping one enormous hand on Silverwing's neck, stroking her feathers gently. "Who can tell me the proper way to approach a hippogriff?" A long silence followed. Finally, a Hufflepuff boy raised his hand tentatively. "You're supposed to bow." "Exactly right," Hagrid beamed. "You bow, and then you wait. Wait for the hippogriff to bow back. If it bows, you can approach. If it doesn't, you back away slowly and respectfully. These creatures demand respect, see? They're proud, and they got every right to be. They're noble creatures, hippogriffs, ancient and wise and not to be trifled with." He demonstrated, releasing Silverwing and taking several steps back. Then, keeping his eyes on the young hippogriff, he bent forward in a low bow, holding the position. Silverwing watched him for a long moment. Then, with a grace that seemed impossible for something with such a blend of different animal parts, she folded her front legs and lowered her eagle head in a bow of her own. "There," Hagrid straightened, his face split by a delighted grin. "She's accepted me greetings. Now I can approach." He moved forward slowly, extending his hand for Silverwing to sniff. The hippogriff examined his hand carefully with her sharp beak, then made a soft chirping sound that seemed to indicate approval. "Who wants to try?" Hagrid asked, looking around at the students. No one moved. Eleanor felt frozen between desire and fear. She desperately wanted to meet Silverwing properly, but the creature was enormous and had a beak that looked like it could do serious damage if provoked. "Come on, don't be shy," Hagrid encouraged. "She's gentle, this one. Raised her myself from a chick. She likes people, long as they're respectful." Eleanor found her hand rising before her courage could stop it. Hagrid's face lit up when he saw. "Excellent. Come on then, come forward slowly." Eleanor's legs felt unsteady as she approached the paddock fence. Priya gave her an encouraging nod, and Ivy whispered, "You've got this." Hagrid helped her over the fence, though helped meant essentially lifting her over it like she weighed nothing. And suddenly, Eleanor was standing in the paddock, far closer to Silverwing than the fence had been. The hippogriff was even more magnificent up close. Her feathers had an iridescent quality, shifting between grey and silver and hints of pale blue. Her eyes were like molten gold, intelligent and watchful. "Right," Hagrid said softly, positioning Eleanor a few meters from Silverwing. "Now, keep your eyes on her. Don't look away. That's rude to a hippogriff. They want to know you're paying attention, that you respect them enough to give them your full focus. Then bow, nice and low, and wait." Eleanor took a deep breath. Her heart was hammering so hard, she was certain everyone could hear it. She fixed her gaze on Silverwing's golden eyes and bent forward in a bow, trying to make it as respectful and genuine as possible. Time seemed to stretch. Eleanor stayed bent, her back beginning to protest, wondering if Silverwing would accept her or if she should straighten up and back away. She could hear the hippogriff moving, the soft click of her hooves on the packed earth, the rustle of her feathers. Then, through her lowered gaze, she saw Silverwing's front legs fold. The hippogriff was bowing. "Excellent," Hagrid whispered. "She's accepted you. Now straighten up slowly and approach. Let her sniff your hand first." Eleanor straightened, her muscles grateful for the movement. Silverwing was watching her with what seemed like curiosity now, her head tilted slightly to one side. Eleanor took a tentative step forward, then another, extending her hand as Hagrid had done. Silverwing's beak was massive up close, curved and sharp and clearly capable of inflicting harm. But the hippogriff's movements were gentle as she leaned forward and sniffed Eleanor's outstretched fingers. Her breath was warm and smelled of hay and something else, something wild and indefinable. Then Silverwing made a soft chirruping sound and pressed her beak lightly against Eleanor's palm. "She likes you," Hagrid said, delighted. "Yeah, can touch her now, if you like. Stroke her neck. She loves that." Eleanor moved her hand slowly to Silverwing's neck, where grey feathers met brown fur in a seamless transition. The feathers were softer than anything she'd ever felt, like silk mixed with down. Beneath them, she could feel the warmth of Silverwing's body, the strong muscles, the steady beat of a heart that seemed both bird-like and horse-like at once. "Hello," Eleanor whispered, just as she'd whispered to the Mimbletonia seedling. "You're beautiful." Silverwing chirped again and leaned into Eleanor's touch, clearly enjoying the attention. Her golden eyes half closed in contentment. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a profound sense of connection, of privilege. This wild, proud creature was allowing her to touch it, was accepting her presence. It was humbling and exhilarating at once. "See," Hagrid said, the watching students, his voice full of pride. "Treat 'em right, show 'em proper respect, and even the proudest creatures all warm to ye. This is what care o' magical creatures is all about. Understanding, respect, and building trust." He gestured for Eleanor to continue petting Silverwing while he explained more to the class. "Hippogriffs are what we call proud creatures. They've got standards, and they won't tolerate insult or disrespect. But that doesn't make them dangerous. It makes them honest. They won't pretend to like you if they don't. And if they do accept you, you know it's genuine." Eleanor continued stroking Silverwing's neck, marveling at the texture of her feathers, the warmth radiating through them. The hippogriff made soft, contented sounds, and Eleanor felt her own nervousness melting away entirely. This wasn't frightening anymore. This was wonderful. Now, Hagrid continued, who else wants to try? One by one, other students came forward. Hagrid guided each of them through the same process: the bow, the wait, the approach. Silverwing accepted most of them, though with one boy who seemed particularly nervous, she refused to bow back. Hagrid had him retreat immediately, explaining gently that the hippogriff could sense his fear and didn't feel comfortable accepting his approach. No shame in it, Hagrid assured the boy, who looked devastated. Some creatures sense fear more than others, and hippogriffs are particularly sensitive. You just need to build your confidence first. We'll try again next lesson, eh? Priya was accepted enthusiastically, Silverwing even nuzzling her braided hair and making playful chirping sounds. Ivy was so gentle and calm that Silverwing practically melted under her touch, leaning into the Hufflepuff girl's hands with obvious pleasure. As each student took their turn, Hagrid explained more about hippogriff behavior and care. He talked about their diet. They were carnivorous, preferring fresh meat, but also enjoying ferrets and birds. He explained their nesting habits, their social structures, the way they formed lifelong bonds with mates. He spoke with such obvious love and knowledge that Eleanor found herself taking mental notes, wishing she'd brought her journal down from the castle. Hippogriffs are also incredibly loyal, Hagrid said as the lesson drew toward its conclusion. The students were now allowed to observe Silverwing more closely, though only a few at a time could be in the paddock. Eleanor had stepped back outside the fence, but was still watching, unable to tear her eyes away from the magnificent creature. If a hippogriff accepts you as a friend, Hagrid continued, it'll remember you. Even years later, they never forget someone who showed them proper respect, and they're protective too. They'll defend someone they care about, even at risk to themselves. He fed Silverwing some strips of raw meat from a bucket, and the hippogriff ate delicately despite her sharp beak, taking each piece gently from his enormous hand. Now, for homework, Hagrid said, and several students groaned good-naturedly. I want you to research hippogriffs and write me a foot of parchment on their care requirements. Include diet, habitat, social needs, and at least 2 magical properties. We'll be working with Silverwing all term, so you need to understand her properly. The class began to disperse, students chattering excitedly about the experience. Eleanor lingered at the fence, watching as Hagrid led Silverwing back into her shelter, still talking to her softly, checking that she had fresh water and comfortable bedding. That was amazing, came a voice beside her. Eleanor turned to find Ivy standing there, her eyes still wide with wonder. I've never touched anything magical before. Not really. Not like that. Me neither, Eleanor admitted. I mean, I've done accidental magic at home, but this was different. This was intentional, connected. Exactly, Ivy breathed. It felt like she was choosing to trust us, you know. Like it meant something that she accepted us. Hagrid emerged from the paddock and latched the gate carefully behind him. He noticed the 2 girls still standing there and smiled broadly. Yeah, 2 enjoyed that, did you? Very much, Eleanor said. Thank you for letting us meet her. Ah, she's a special one, Silverwing is. Hagrid said, glancing back at the paddock with obvious affection. Got a gentle soul for a hippogriff. Her mum's one of the wildest in the forest. Won't let anyone near her. But Silverwing here, she took the people right away. Makes me think she'll be a good ambassador for her kind. Show people that hippogriffs aren't just dangerous beasts. They're intelligent, emotional creatures deserving of respect and care. He looked at Eleanor and Ivy seriously. That's what I hope to teach you in this class. It's not just about learning facts or being able to name creatures. It's about understanding that magical creatures are living beings with their own thoughts and feelings and dignity. They deserve to be treated as such. Eleanor nodded, feeling the weight of his words. It was similar to what Professor Sprout had said about plants, that caring for them properly meant forming a relationship, paying attention, offering respect. Perhaps that was the underlying lesson in all of this, that magic wasn't just about power or knowledge, but about connection and care. Right then, Hagrid said, his serious expression giving way to another broad smile. Off you go. I'll see you next lesson. We'll be learning about proper feeding techniques and how to read hippogriff body language. Eleanor and Ivy walked back up toward the castle together, falling into step with Priya and several other students. Everyone was talking animatedly about Silverwing, about the feeling of touching her feathers, about the intelligence in her golden eyes. I can't believe we actually did that, Priya said, shaking her head in wonder. I thought care of magical creatures would be more theoretical, I suppose. Looking at pictures and reading books. I didn't think we'd be meeting real creatures in our first lesson. Hagrid's not really the theoretical type, observed Thomas, the Gryffindor boy who'd been nervous about McGonagall earlier. He's all hands-on. Did you see how he was with Silverwing? Like she was a pet dog rather than a creature that could probably take his arm off if she wanted to. I think that's why she's so gentle, Eleanor said thoughtfully. Because he trusts her and she trusts him. It's like he said, it's about the relationship. They climbed the stone steps to the entrance hall, and Eleanor checked her pocket watch, a gift from her grandfather when she'd received her Hogwarts letter. They had about an hour before lunch, and then Transfiguration with Professor McGonagall in the afternoon. The thought of McGonagall's class brought back a flutter of nervousness, but it was dampened by the euphoria still coursing through Eleanor from meeting Silverwing. If she could bow to a hippogriff and be accepted, if she could stroke those soft feathers and feel that magnificent creature's trust, then surely she could handle Transfiguration Library, Priya suggested. We could start on our homework. We've got 2 assignments now, one for herbology and one for care of magical creatures. Good idea, Eleanor agreed. She was actually looking forward to the research, to learning more about the Mimulus Mimbletonia and about hippogriffs. The assignments didn't feel like burdens. They felt like opportunities to deepen her understanding of things that fascinated her. The library was quiet when they arrived, with only a handful of older students scattered among the shelves and tables. Madame Pince, the librarian, watched them enter with her usual severe expression, but said nothing as they made their way toward the section on magical creatures. Eleanor found herself thinking about Silverwing as she pulled books from the shelves, enormous leather-bound volumes with titles like The Care and Handling of Hippogriffs and Proud Creatures, a study of magical beast psychology, She thought about those golden eyes, that soft chirrup of acceptance, the way the hippogriff had leaned into her touch. 2 lessons in, and Hogwarts was already exceeding every expectation Eleanor had held. The magic here wasn't just in the moving staircases, or the enchanted ceiling, or the portraits that talked. It was in the patient care Professor Sprout showed her plants. It was in Hagrid's obvious love for the creatures in his care. It was in the connections being formed between students and plants, between people and magical creatures, between Eleanor herself and this new world she was learning to navigate. She opened the first book and began to read, her quill poised to take notes. And outside the library windows, the autumn sun continued its arc across the sky, marking the passage of another magical morning at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The afternoon had turned cooler by the time Eleanor and her fellow first-year Gryffindors made their way to Transfiguration. Clouds had rolled in during lunch, casting the castle corridors in a grey light that made the torches seem warmer and more necessary. Eleanor's stomach felt tight with nervousness. Not the excited kind she'd felt before meeting Silverwing, but something more apprehensive. Professor McGonagall had a reputation. Even students who'd never had a lesson with her spoke of her in hushed, respectful tones. She was brilliant, they said, demanding, fair but uncompromising. She could transmogrify into a cat, which seemed to Eleanor both magnificent and slightly terrifying. What kind of witch achieved that level of transfiguration skill? Classroom 1B, Priya muttered, checking a piece of parchment where she'd copied their schedule. Should be just up these stairs and to the left. They climbed the stone staircase with several other Gryffindors, their footsteps echoing. At the top, Eleanor could see a group of Slytherins already gathering outside a closed wooden door. The students from both houses eyed each other with the automatic wariness that seemed built into the house rivalry, though no one said anything hostile. The door was firmly shut. Eleanor checked her pocket watch. 5 minutes until 2 o'clock. She wondered if they were supposed to wait outside or enter. Before she could decide, the door swung open from the inside. Professor McGonagall stood framed in the doorway, tall and severe in her dark robes and pointed hat. Her expression was stern, her mouth set in a thin line, and her sharp eyes swept over the assembled first years with an intensity that made Eleanor want to stand up straighter. "You may enter," Professor McGonagall said crisply. "Choose your seats quickly and quietly. Class begins precisely at 2 o'clock, not a moment later." The students filed in, moving with careful quiet. The classroom was different from both the warm greenhouse and Hagrid's outdoor paddock. This space was orderly and precise. Rows of wooden desks facing a larger desk at the front, behind which stood a blackboard already covered in neat, careful handwriting. The windows were tall and let in the grey afternoon light, and the stone walls were bare, except for a few diagrams showing the principles of transformation. Eleanor chose a desk near the middle of the room, neither too close to the front, nor too far back. Priya slid into the seat beside her, and they both pulled out fresh parchment, quills, and their copies of A Beginner's Guide to Transfiguration by Emmerich Switch. Professor McGonagall closed the door with a decisive click at exactly 2 o'clock. She moved to stand behind her desk, her hands clasped in front of her, and regarded the class in silence for a long moment. Eleanor found herself barely breathing. There was something about the professor's presence that commanded absolute attention. not through warmth or enthusiasm like Hagrid, not through gentle encouragement like Professor Sprout, but through sheer force of competence and expectation. Transfiguration, Professor McGonagall began, her Scottish accent crisp and clear, is some of the most complex and dangerous magic you will learn at Hogwarts. Anyone messing around in my class will leave and not come back. You have been warned. She let that sink in, her gaze moving across each student's face as though memorizing them. That said, she continued, and her expression softened fractionally, so slightly Eleanor might have imagined it. Transfiguration is also among the most rewarding branches of magic. To successfully transform one thing into another requires precision, concentration, and a deep understanding of both what something is and what you wish it to become. Is magic at its most fundamental, the rearrangement of reality itself. Professor McGonagall moved to the blackboard and tapped it with her wand. The writing already there shifted aside, and new words appeared in the same neat script. Transformation formula. Objects to objects. We will begin, as all students must, with the transformation of inanimate objects into other inanimate objects. This is the foundation upon which all other transfiguration is built. Before you can transform a teacup into a tortoise, you must master the transformation of something simple into something equally simple. She turned back to face the class, pulling her wand from her robes in one smooth motion. Today, you will learn the basic principles and attempt your first transformation. You will be turning a match into a needle. With a flick of her wand, matches appeared on each desk, plain wooden matches, unremarkable and entirely mundane. Eleanor stared at hers, trying to imagine it as a needle. The match was organic, wooden, created from a tree. A needle was metal, inorganic, forged by heat and hammer. How could magic bridge that gap? The incantation, Professor McGonagall said, writing it on the board, is mutatio acum. The wand movement is thus. She demonstrated a precise flick followed by a circular motion. Observe carefully. You will attempt this yourselves shortly, but first, theory. For the next 20 minutes, Professor McGonagall explained the principles of object-to-object transformation with a thoroughness that made Eleanor's hand cramp from taking notes. She discussed the nature of matter, the way magic could rearrange molecular structures, the importance of visualization and intent. She drew diagrams showing the proper wand movements from multiple angles. You must see the needle in your mind, she emphasized, tapping the blackboard where she'd drawn both a match and a needle. Not vaguely, not approximately. You must know exactly what a needle looks like, its length, its diameter, its point, the eye through which thread passes. Half-formed visualization produces half-formed transformations, and half-formed transformations can be dangerous. She illustrated this by pulling a match from her desk and performing a deliberately poor transformation. The match began to change, but only partially. It became thin and somewhat metallic, but retained wood grain and wouldn't straighten properly. It looked wrong, unsettling. This is what happens when your intent is unclear, Professor McGonagall said, banishing the malformed object with another flick of her wand. Partial transformations. They are unstable and often painful if attempted on living subjects, which is why we begin with matches rather than mice. A nervous ripple went through the students. Eleanor felt her apprehension growing. What if she couldn't do this? What if her transformation was partial or wrong or Now, Professor McGonagall said, interrupting Eleanor's spiral of worry, you will attempt it yourselves. Remember, clear visualization, proper wand movement, correct pronunciation. Do not expect success on your first try. Transfiguration is difficult magic. I will be impressed if anyone manages even a slight change in their match by the end of this lesson. That was oddly reassuring. Eleanor picked up her wand, ashwood, unicorn hair, 11 inches, and looked at her match again. She tried to picture a needle in her mind. Her grandmother sewed, so Eleanor had seen plenty of needles, thin, silver, straight, sharp at one end, with a small, oval eye at the other, smooth surface that caught the light. Around her, other students were beginning to attempt the spell. She heard the murmur of mutatio acum, repeated over and over, saw wands flicking and circling in the prescribed pattern. Most matches remained completely unchanged. A few emitted small sparks or puffs of smoke, but showed no actual transformation. Eleanor took a breath, steadied her wand hand, and pointed at her match. Mutatio acum, she said clearly, executing the wand movement as precisely as she could manage. Nothing happened. The match lay on her desk, utterly unchanged. She tried again, and again. On her fourth attempt, the match gave a small shudder, but remained stubbornly wooden. Good, came Professor McGonagall's voice suddenly from behind her. Eleanor jumped slightly. The professor had moved silently between the desks and was now observing her work. You achieved a minor reaction. That indicates your wand movement is approximately correct and your pronunciation adequate. Now focus more intently on your visualization. What you're seeing in your mind is too vague. Professor McGonagall moved on to the next student before Eleanor could respond. Eleanor stared at her match, trying to see it more clearly in her mind. Not just any needle, a specific needle. She thought of her grandmother's sewing basket, pictured the small silver needle her grandmother used for delicate hemming work, that particular needle, that exact shape and size. Mutatio acum. The match trembled, its surface rippled like water, and then, just for a moment, one end became silver and pointed before reverting back to wood. Eleanor's heart leaped. She'd done something. It hadn't been a full transformation, not even close, but she'd achieved a partial change. The match had, for just a second, begun to become a needle. Excellent progress, Miss Ashby, Professor McGonagall said. And Eleanor realized the professor must have been watching. You began to establish the transformation. Continue with that same clarity of intent. The praise, delivered in Professor McGonagall's characteristically crisp tone, nevertheless, made Eleanor feel warm with pride. She tried again, holding that same clear image in her mind. This time, the match's point became silver and stayed that way for several seconds before fading back. The next attempt, nearly a third of the match, transformed before reverting. Eleanor could feel herself improving with each try, understanding the magic more intuitively. Around the classroom, other students were having varied success. A Slytherin boy had managed to make his match go completely silver, though it retained its original shape and hadn't actually become needle-like. Priya had achieved a consistent shimmer across her match's surface, but no structural change. One Gryffindor girl's match had split in half when she'd pronounced the incantation incorrectly, earning a sharp look from Professor McGonagall and a reminder about the importance of precise pronunciation. Professor McGonagall moved continuously between the desks. her sharp eyes missing nothing. She corrected wand movements with precision, clarified theory when students seemed confused, and demonstrated the proper technique multiple times for those struggling to grasp it. Her teaching style was exacting but not unkind, Eleanor realized. She simply had extraordinarily high standards and expected students to meet them. "Mr. Knott," Professor McGonagall said to the Slytherin boy who'd achieved the silver coloring, "your color transformation is adequate, but you're neglecting the structural component. A needle is not simply a silver match. Visualize the thinness, the absolute straightness. Magic responds to specificity." She demonstrated on his match, her wand movement so precise it looked mechanical. The match transformed instantly into a perfect needle, thin, straight silver, with a sharp point and a tiny eye for thread. It was flawless. "That is your goal," she said, vanishing the needle and returning the match to its original state. Perfect transformation. It may take weeks or months to achieve, but that is what you're working toward. Anything less is incomplete magic. Eleanor tried again, inspired by seeing the perfect transformation. Her match was definitely changing more dramatically now. The point stayed silver and sharp, and the entire thing was becoming thinner. But halfway down, it remained stubbornly wooden, and it had a slight curve that a real needle would never have. "Better," Professor McGonagall said, pausing at Eleanor's desk again. "You're making genuine progress. The curve indicates you're losing focus partway through the transformation. You must maintain your visualization throughout the entire casting, not just at the beginning." Eleanor nodded, filing away the advice. She could feel her concentration flagging. This was mentally exhausting in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't like waving a wand and making sparks fly. This required sustained, intense focus on multiple elements simultaneously. The wand movement, the pronunciation, the visualization, the intent. It was like trying to juggle while doing mathematics in her head. The lesson continued, and gradually Eleanor's match began to stay transformed for longer periods. It wasn't perfect. The metal was slightly too thick, the point not quite sharp enough, and she still couldn't achieve the eye for threading. But it was recognizably needle-like more often than not. "Time," Professor McGonagall announced eventually, and the word fell like a gavel. Students looked up from their matches, some relieved, others frustrated. "Wands down." She moved to the front of the classroom, her expression thoughtful as she surveyed the results of their efforts. "Some of you achieved notable progress for a first lesson," she said. "Others struggled to produce any change at all. This is normal. Transfiguration is not innate talent. It is learned skill built through practice, patience, and precision. Those who succeeded today did so because they focused. Those who did not should examine where their concentration lapsed." Her gaze swept the room, and Eleanor felt it rest on her for just a moment. Was that approval in Professor McGonagall's eyes? It was difficult to tell. "Your homework," the professor continued, "is to write 12 inches on the fundamental principles of object-to-object transformation, focusing on why clear visualization is essential. Additionally, I want you to research the history of Transfiguration as a discipline. Who were the key figures? What breakthroughs did they achieve?" Due next Monday. She moved to the blackboard and added the assignment in her perfect script. "You are dismissed. Leave your matches on your desks. Do not attempt to take partially transformed objects with you. they will destabilize and could cause injury. Students began to pack their bags with quiet efficiency. Eleanor noticed that even the usual post-class chatter was subdued. Professor McGonagall's classroom seemed to demand a certain level of decorum, even after the lesson ended. As Eleanor stood to leave, Professor McGonagall's voice stopped her. "Miss Ashby, a moment, please." Eleanor's heart skipped. Had she done something wrong? She approached the professor's desk nervously, while Priya waited by the door, giving her an encouraging look. Professor McGonagall was writing something on a piece of parchment, her quill moving in quick, efficient strokes. She finished, sprinkled sand to dry the ink, and looked up at Eleanor with an expression that wasn't quite stern but wasn't exactly warm either. "You showed aptitude today," she said without preamble. "Your visualization was clearer than most, and you learned from correction quickly. These are indicators of potential skill in Transfiguration." Eleanor felt herself flush with pleasure. "Thank you, Professor." "Don't let it make you complacent," Professor McGonagall continued, her tone brooking no argument. "Aptitude means nothing without discipline. I've seen talented students waste their gifts through laziness, and I've seen determined students with modest natural ability become excellent Transfiguration practitioners. The difference is always effort." "Yes, Professor." Professor McGonagall's expression softened. "Barely, but unmistakably. That said, you should be pleased with your progress today. Continue practicing the wand movement, even without your match. Muscle memory is crucial in Transfiguration. The more automatic the physical component becomes, the more mental energy you can devote to visualization and intent." She handed Eleanor the parchment she'd been writing on. "These are some additional resources in the library that go beyond your textbook. They're not required reading, but they may deepen your understanding if you're interested." Eleanor took the parchment carefully, scanning the list of titles. They were advanced texts, some that looked like they wouldn't normally be recommended to first years. "Thank you, Professor," she said again, genuinely touched. "I'll read them." "See that you do. Now, off you go. I'm sure you have other lessons to prepare for." Eleanor nodded and hurried to join Priya, who was practically bouncing with curiosity. They exited the classroom together, and as soon as they were a safe distance down the corridor, Priya exploded with questions. What did she want? "Are you in trouble? You don't look like you're in trouble. You're smiling, so it must be good." "She said I showed aptitude," Eleanor said, still feeling slightly dazed, "and she gave me a list of extra reading materials." "Extra homework?" Priya looked horrified, then thoughtful. "Wait, no, that's actually a compliment, isn't it? McGonagall wouldn't give you extra resources unless she thought you could handle them. Eleanor, I think she singled you out as someone with potential." Eleanor looked down at the parchment in her hands, at Professor McGonagall's precise handwriting listing books, with titles like Advanced Theory of Transfiguration and the Molecular Properties of Magical Transformation. It was daunting, but it was also thrilling. "How did you find the lesson?" Eleanor asked, carefully folding the parchment and tucking it into her bag. Priya made a face. "Difficult. I got my match to sparkle a bit, but that was about it. Transfiguration is hard, Eleanor. Like, really hard. I thought I was decent at magic, but apparently turning one thing into another thing requires a completely different kind of thinking." They descended a staircase. thankfully one that stayed still and headed toward Gryffindor Tower. Other students were moving through the corridors, the castle coming alive in that particular way it had in the late afternoon, full of energy and noise and the casual magic of everyday life. I think that's what makes it interesting, though, Eleanor said thoughtfully. It's not just about saying words and waving a wand. It's about really understanding things, what they are, what they could be. It's almost philosophical. That sounds like something a Ravenclaw would say, Priya teased, but she was smiling. But I get what you mean. It's just going to take me a lot more practice than it apparently takes you. They reached the portrait of the fat lady who was dozing in her frame, and Priya spoke the password, Fortuna Major, to wake her. The portrait swung open, and they climbed through into the warm, welcoming chaos of the Gryffindor common room. The space was already filling with students back from their various classes. A group of third years had claimed the best spots near the fireplace and were working on what looked like potions homework, arguing good-naturedly about proper stirring techniques. Some second years were playing Exploding Snap in a corner, their shouts of laughter punctuating the general noise. The fire crackled in the hearth, kept perfectly maintained by house elves, Eleanor knew now, though she'd never seen one. And the late afternoon light, streaming through the windows, made the red and gold furnishings glow warmly. Eleanor and Priya found 2 empty armchairs near a window and collapsed into them. Eleanor pulled out her Transfiguration notes, wanting to review them while the lesson was still fresh in her mind. She reread Professor McGonagall's explanations about molecular transformation, about the importance of seeing not just the surface of what you wanted to create, but understanding its essential nature. You know what's strange? Priya said after a few minutes of comfortable silence. All 3 of our classes so far have been completely different, but they've all kind of been saying the same thing. Eleanor looked up from her notes. What do you mean? Well, Professor Sprout talked about really paying attention to plants, understanding what they need, forming relationships with them. Hagrid talked about respecting creatures, reading them, building trust. And McGonagall, Priya gestured at Eleanor's notes. She's talking about really seeing things, understanding their essential nature. It's all about attention and understanding and seeing properly, I suppose. Eleanor sat back in her chair, struck by the observation. Priya was right. Underneath the different subjects and teaching styles, there was a common thread. Magic wasn't just about power or technique. It was about perception, about truly seeing and understanding what you were working with. That's really insightful, Eleanor said. Priya shrugged, but looked pleased. I'm not as naturally good at the practical stuff as you seem to be, but I'm decent at noticing patterns. Maybe that's my thing. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, working on their various assignments. Around them, the common room continued its cheerful noise. Someone's chocolate frog escaped, and they had to be chased down. A group of girls were planning a trip to Hogsmeade for the next weekend. Only third years and up were allowed, Eleanor had learned, which seemed terribly unfair. An owl tapped at one of the windows, delivering a package that was received with delighted squeals. Eleanor found herself thinking about Professor McGonagall's unexpected praise, about the way the stern professor's expression had softened just slightly when she'd acknowledged Eleanor's progress. It made the difficult work seem worthwhile. Knowing that genuine effort was noticed and appreciated, she thought about her partially transformed match, about the way it had finally begun to look like a needle, even if it wasn't perfect yet. She thought about Professor McGonagall's demonstration, that flawless transformation accomplished with such ease and precision. That was mastery. That was what years of practice and study could achieve. Eleanor pulled out the parchment with the reading list and studied it again. The book sounded complex, probably beyond her current level of understanding. But Professor McGonagall had given them to her anyway, which meant the professor believed Eleanor could handle them, or at least that she could grow into handling them. "I'm going to the library before dinner," Eleanor announced. "Want to come?" Priya groaned. "More studying? We just had class." "I want to look up one of these books McGonagall recommended, just to see what it's like." "You're going to be insufferable by the end of term, aren't you?" But Priya was smiling as she said it. "Fine, I'll come. I should start on that herbology research anyway. What plant are you doing yours on?" "I was thinking about gillyweed," Eleanor said. "It's used in potions and has that interesting property of letting wizards breathe underwater. Seems like it would have a good story." They gathered their things and headed back out of the common room, navigating the portrait hole and starting the journey down to the library. The castle was settling into its evening rhythm now. Dinner was still an hour away, and students were using the time to study, socialize, or explore. As they walked, Eleanor found herself thinking about how different her 3 classes had been, yet how each had captivated her in its own way. Professor Sprout's gentle patience, Hagrid's enthusiastic passion, Professor McGonagall's exacting standards. They were all teaching her different aspects of magic, different ways of being a witch. And somehow, impossibly, she was beginning to feel like she might actually belong here, like she might actually become the kind of witch who could coax plants into thriving, who could earn a hippogriff's trust, who could transform a match into a needle through sheer force of will and clarity of vision. The day wasn't over yet. There was still homework to start, dinner to eat, the evening to enjoy. But as Eleanor pushed open the library doors and breathed in the familiar smell of old books and parchment, she felt something settle in her chest. Something like contentment. Something like purpose. Hogwarts was teaching her magic. But more than that, it was teaching her how to see the world differently. With attention, with care, with the understanding that everything, from the smallest seedling to the proudest magical creature to an ordinary wooden match, deserved to be truly seen for what it was and what it could become. And that, Eleanor was beginning to realize, might be the most important magic of all. Wednesday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth, as though September had momentarily forgotten it was meant to be easing into autumn. Sunlight streamed through the tower windows of the Gryffindor dormitory, and Eleanor woke to the sound of birdsong. Ordinary birds, she thought, not magical ones, though at Hogwarts it was sometimes difficult to tell the difference. She dressed quickly, excitement already building. Today they had charms for the first time, and from everything Eleanor had heard, Professor Flitwick's classes were meant to be wonderful. He was the charms master and head of Ravenclaw House, reportedly brilliant and enthusiastic in equal measure. Several older students had mentioned him with genuine fondness, which seemed like a good sign. "Morning," Priya mumbled from her bed, one eye barely open. "Is it really as bright as it looks, or am I still dreaming?" "It's really that bright," Eleanor confirmed, tying her Gryffindor tie with practiced ease now. She'd finally mastered the knot after several disastrous early attempts. "Beautiful day for charms." "Everything's beautiful to you lately," Priya said, but she was smiling as she threw back her covers. "You're turning into one of those insufferably cheerful morning people." Eleanor couldn't deny it. The past week and a half at Hogwarts had been extraordinary. Each class revealed new wonders. Each day brought small victories. Her Mimbleless Mimbletonia seedling was thriving. Silverwing had remembered her at their second Care of Magical Creatures lesson and had chirruped in greeting, and her match-to-needle transformation was improving steadily. She'd even managed a complete transformation yesterday evening while practicing in the common room, though the needle had been slightly bent and had reverted after only a few seconds. Breakfast in the Great Hall was its usual organized chaos. The enchanted ceiling showed a perfect blue sky, with just a few wispy clouds drifting lazily across it. Owls swooped in with the morning post, and the smell of fresh bread and porridge filled the air. Eleanor helped herself to toast with marmalade and a cup of tea, savoring the quiet moment before the day's learning began. The charms corridor was on the 3rd floor, and Eleanor and Priya made their way there with a growing group of first-year Ravenclaws. Charms was a Gryffindor Ravenclaw class. The Ravenclaws seemed excited in a particularly intense way, chattering about wand movements and theoretical applications with an enthusiasm that bordered on academic fervor. "That's their head of house," Priya whispered, nodding toward the Ravenclaws. "They probably want to impress him." The charms classroom door was already open when they arrived, and Professor Flitwick's voice could be heard from within, humming what sounded like a complicated melody. Eleanor peered inside and saw a classroom that was brighter and more welcoming than the austere Transfiguration space. The windows were large and let in generous amounts of sunlight. The desks were arranged in a gentle semicircle rather than strict rows, and the walls were decorated with diagrams showing various wand movements, each one illustrated with small magical sparkles that demonstrated the motion. Professor Flitwick himself stood at the front of the room, or rather, stood on top of a stack of books behind his desk, which brought him to approximately the height of an average adult. He was tiny, this professor, so small that Eleanor's first thought was that he must have some goblin ancestry. But his face was kind and deeply lined with smile wrinkles, and his white hair stood up in all directions as though he'd been running his hands through it, excitedly. Come in," he called in a surprisingly high, squeaky voice when he noticed students gathering at the door. "Don't be shy. Find seats wherever you like. I'm not particular about seating arrangements. Some teachers are, I know, but I find that students learn best when they're comfortable." The students filed in, and Eleanor chose a desk near the middle, with good sight lines to the front. Priya sat beside her, and 2 Ravenclaw girls claimed the desk to their right, already pulling out fresh parchment and organizing their quills with meticulous care. More students arrived, and Professor Flitwick greeted each one with genuine enthusiasm, sometimes calling them by name. He clearly had an excellent memory. When the clock tower chimed 9, he clapped his tiny hands together with a sound like a small thunderclap that reverberated through the room with unexpected volume. Right then. Welcome, welcome to Charms. His squeaky voice was full of such joy that Eleanor found herself smiling automatically. I'm Professor Flitwick, and I have the enormous pleasure of introducing you to what I consider the most versatile and useful branch of magic, charms. He hopped down from his bookstack with surprising agility and began pacing in front of his desk, his arms gesturing expressively as he spoke. Now, some of you may be wondering, what exactly is a charm? How does it differ from transfiguration or hexes or jinxes? Excellent questions. A charm, in the simplest terms, is a spell that adds properties to an object or creature without changing its fundamental nature. We don't transform things. That's transfiguration. We enhance them, alter their behavior, give them new abilities. He pulled his wand from his robes with a flourish. It was an elegant thing, pale wood that seemed to glow slightly in the morning light. For instance, Professor Flitwick continued, pointing his wand at a teacup on his desk. If I wanted this teacup to fly, I wouldn't transform it into a bird. That would be transfiguration. Instead, I'd use the levitation charm, Wingardium Leviosa. He flicked his wand with a complicated swooping motion, and the teacup rose gracefully into the air. It floated in a gentle circle around the classroom, passing over students' heads, before returning to the desk and settling there as lightly as a feather. The teacup is still a teacup, Professor Flitwick announced gleefully. But it can now do something teacups ordinarily cannot. It can fly. That's the beauty of charms. We work with what things are and help them do more. He hopped back onto his bookstack, and Eleanor noticed that the books themselves were quite advanced texts. The Theory of Charm Work, Quintessence, A Quest, and several others with titles she couldn't quite read from her angle. Today, Professor Flitwick said, his eyes twinkling behind his spectacles, we're going to learn the wand lighting charm. It's one of the first spells most young witches and wizards learn, and it's wonderfully useful. Can anyone tell me why having a reliable light source might be important? Several hands shot up, mostly from the Ravenclaws. Professor Flitwick pointed at a girl with dark hair in elaborate braids. For reading in dark places, she offered. Excellent. Yes, absolutely. What else? A Gryffindor boy spoke up. For finding things you dropped. Very practical. I like it. What else? Professor Flitwick was bouncing slightly on his books, clearly delighted by the engagement. Eleanor found her hand rising. Professor Flitwick's gaze landed on her with such genuine interest that her nervousness evaporated. Miss Ashby, isn't it? Yes, what's your thought? For safety, Eleanor said. In unfamiliar places or situations where you need to see what's around you. Precisely, Professor Flitwick beamed. Safety, practicality, convenience. The wand lighting charm provides all of these. It's simple magic, but simple doesn't mean unimportant. Some of the most crucial spells you'll ever learn are simple ones you'll use every single day. He hopped down again and began writing on the blackboard with chalk that wrote in sparkling silver letters. Lumos wand movement. Gentle upward flick. Intent. Bringing light into darkness. The incantation is Lumos, Professor Flitwick explained, turning back to face the class. From the Latin word for light. The wand movement is simple. A gentle upward flick, as though you're encouraging the light to rise from your wand tip. And the intent is crucial in all charm work. He held up his wand and demonstrated the motion in slow detail. You're not demanding light. You're not forcing it. You're inviting it, encouraging it, asking your wand to produce something helpful and warm. Charms work best when your intent is positive, when you're working with the magic rather than trying to dominate it. This resonated with what Eleanor had learned in her other classes. Professor Sprout talking about caring for plants, Hagrid about respecting creatures, even Professor McGonagall's emphasis on truly understanding what you were working with. Magic, it seemed, responded better to partnership than to force. "Now, I'll demonstrate the full casting," Professor Flitwick said. He held his wand at chest height, pointed slightly upward, and spoke clearly. "Lumos." He flicked his wand gently, and instantly a warm, bright light bloomed at his tip, illuminating his face from below and making his white hair seem to glow. The light was steady and pleasant, not harsh like electric lights, but softer, warmer, almost alive. "You see," he said, his face glowing literally with enthusiasm. "Simple, effective, wonderful. And to extinguish it, Nox." The light went out as quickly as it had appeared. He gestured to the class. "Everyone, take out your wands. We'll practice the movement first without the incantation. I want to see those gentle upward flicks. Gentle, mind you. No wild waving. Charms require precision, not vigor." Eleanor pulled out her wand and held it as Professor Flitwick had demonstrated. Around her, other students were doing the same, and the classroom filled with the soft swish of wands moving through air. "Gentle," Professor Flitwick called out, moving between the desks. "Miss Morrison, not quite so aggressive. You're inviting light, not challenging it to a duel. Mr. Boot, excellent form. Very good. Miss Ashby, nice and smooth. That's the way." Eleanor practiced the motion repeatedly, feeling the way her wand wanted to move, the natural arc it followed. Her ashwood wand felt warm in her hand, comfortable, responsive. After several minutes of practice, Professor Flitwick hopped back onto his book stack. "Right then, I think we're ready to try adding the incantation. Remember, Lumos, with the upward flick, intent matters. You want light, warm, and helpful light. You're not trying to create a bonfire, just a steady glow. On my count, 1, 2, 3, Lumos." The classroom filled with the sound of 19 voices saying Lumos at varying volumes and levels of confidence. Wands flicked upward throughout the room. The results were varied. Several wands produced nothing at all. A few managed weak sparks that died immediately. One Ravenclaw boy's wand emitted a puff of smoke that smelled faintly of burnt toast. But here and there, small successes. A dim glow on one wand, a flicker of real light on another. Eleanor focused on her wand tip, pictured warm light blooming there like a flower opening. She thought of the candles floating in the great hall, of the torches in the corridors, of moonlight on water. "Lumos," she said softly, flicking her wand upward. A spark appeared at the tip, bright and promising, but it died almost instantly. "Close!" Professor Flitwick's voice came from somewhere to her left. "Very close. Your intent was there. I could feel it in the magic. Try again, and hold the image of light in your mind as you cast." Eleanor tried again, holding the thought of light more firmly this time. "Lumos." The spark appeared again, stronger this time, and it held for nearly 3 seconds before guttering out. But it had been real light, unmistakable light. Excellent progress. Professor Flitwick appeared beside her desk, having apparently climbed onto something to see better. Eleanor suspected he used the small stool he carried around, though she couldn't spot it. You're very close, Miss Ashby. The light wants to come. You just need to invite it more confidently. Try once more. Around the classroom, other students were having breakthroughs. A Ravenclaw girl managed a steady glow that lasted for 5 seconds before she squeaked in surprise and lost her concentration. Priya's wand was producing consistent sparks, getting closer with each attempt. The room was filling with small bursts of light, like dozens of fireflies winking in and out of existence. Eleanor centered herself, feeling the comfortable weight of her wand, the warmth of the wood against her palm. She thought about why she wanted the light, not just to complete an assignment, but because light was warmth and safety, and the ability to see clearly. Light was understanding. Light was guidance. Lumos, she said with quiet confidence, and flicked her wand. Light bloomed at the tip, steady and warm and bright. It held. Eleanor stared at it in wonder, watching it glow like a small captured star, illuminating her parchment and casting gentle shadows across her desk. Perfect. Professor Flitwick squeaked with delight, clapping his small hands together. Absolutely perfect, Miss Ashby. That's exactly right. Steady, warm, controlled. Well done indeed. Eleanor felt a surge of pride warm her chest. She kept her focus on the light, maintaining it, and it continued to glow steadily. Around her, other students were noticing, some pausing in their own attempts to look at her success. Don't lose focus now, Professor Flitwick advised kindly. The light will hold as long as your intent holds. When you want to extinguish it, simply say, Nox, and will the light to fade. Eleanor maintained the light for another few seconds, enjoying the simple pleasure of her first fully successful charm, then spoke clearly. Nox. The light faded smoothly, leaving only the ordinary sunlight from the windows. But Eleanor's wand tip felt warm, as though it remembered the magic it had just performed. Try again, Professor Flitwick encouraged, already moving to help another student. Practice the full cycle. Lumos to create, Nox to extinguish. The more you do it, the more natural it becomes. Eleanor practiced the spell repeatedly, and each time it came easier. The light bloomed faster, burned steadier, responded more smoothly to her intent. By her 10th successful casting, she barely had to think about it. The magic flowed naturally from thought to wand to light. Other students were achieving success now too. Priya finally managed a steady glow and let out a delighted laugh. The Ravenclaw girl who'd succeeded earlier was now producing light so bright, Professor Flitwick had to remind her to moderate her intent. They wanted illumination, not blinding brilliance. Soon the classroom was filled with wand lights, dozens of small glowing tips creating a constellation of artificial stars. Marvelous, marvelous, Professor Flitwick called out, moving between desks and offering encouragement or gentle corrections. Those of you who've succeeded, try varying the intensity. Think of dimmer light for reading, brighter light for searching. Those still working on your first success, don't be discouraged. Some magic takes time. Keep practicing the wand movement and focus on your intent. Eleanor experimented with different intensities of light, finding she could make her wand light as dim as a candle or as bright as a small torch simply by adjusting her mental image of what she wanted. It was fascinating, the way the magic responded so directly to thought and will. Now, Professor Flitwick said, after most students had achieved at least a flicker of success, let's talk about the theory behind what you're doing. Those of you with steady lights, you may extinguish them and take notes. Nox, Eleanor murmured, and her light faded obediently. She pulled her parchment closer and readied her quill. Professor Flitwick was drawing diagrams on the board now, showing the flow of magic from wizard to wand to effect. The wand lighting charm is considered a basic utility spell, but it demonstrates several fundamental principles of charm work. First, it shows us that charms add properties, in this case, luminescence, without changing the essential nature of the object. Your wand doesn't become light, it produces light. Second, it demonstrates the importance of intent in spellcasting. The incantation and wand movement are formulae, yes, but they're incomplete without the wizard's will behind them. You could say lumos 1,000 times and flick your wand perfectly, but if you don't genuinely intend to create light, nothing will happen. He turned back to face the class, his expression becoming more serious, though no less kind. This is why charms are considered somewhat more accessible than Transfiguration. In Transfiguration, you must understand the fundamental nature of what you're transforming, a complex intellectual and magical exercise. In charms, you must primarily understand what you want to achieve and maintain clear intent. Both are difficult, but in different ways. Eleanor thought about this comparison. Professor McGonagall had emphasized visualization and understanding, seeing the needle clearly enough to transform the match into it. Professor Flitwick was emphasizing intent and desire, wanting light strongly enough to bring it into being. Different approaches to magic, both valid, both requiring different skills. The homework, Professor Flitwick announced, and there were collective groans that made him chuckle good-naturedly, is to practice lumos and nox until you can perform both reliably and quickly. I also want you to research 3 practical applications of the wand lighting charm beyond simple illumination. Historical examples are excellent. Write me 12 inches on what you discover. And remember, those of you still working on achieving your first successful casting, don't be discouraged. Come see me during office hours if you'd like extra help. I'm always delighted to work one-on-one with students who are struggling. The lesson was drawing to a close, but Professor Flitwick had one more demonstration to share. He produced his wand again and cast lumos, but this time he added something to it. The light at his wand tip shifted, becoming not just bright but colorful. It cycled through pale blue, soft pink, gentle green, warm gold. As you become more advanced, he explained, the colored lights playing across his delighted face, you can modify basic charms in countless ways, change colors, intensities, even the quality of light. Some wizards learn to create light that feels warm, others that feels cool. The possibilities are limited only by your skill and imagination. He extinguished the light with a casual nox and beamed at them all. That's something to look forward to in your future studies. For now, master the basics. Every expert was once a beginner, and every complex spell builds on simple foundations. The class was dismissed, and students began packing their bags amid excited chatter. Eleanor noticed that many of them were still practicing lumos as they prepared to leave, wand lights flickering on and off as they tested their newfound ability. That was brilliant, Priya said as they filed out of the classroom. I mean, properly brilliant. I thought charms would be boring, just learning practical spells and such, but Flitwick makes it fun. He really loves teaching, Eleanor agreed. She had her wand still in her hand and couldn't resist casting Lumos once more as they walked down the corridor. The light bloomed obediently, and she smiled at it before extinguishing it again. You picked that up frighteningly fast, Priya observed, though she didn't sound resentful, just impressed. First successful casting within, 15 minutes? I got lucky, Eleanor said, though she suspected it was more than luck. Something about charms had clicked for her immediately. The way Professor Flitwick described working with magic rather than forcing it, inviting rather than demanding. It resonated with how she thought, how she approached problems. They made their way back toward Gryffindor Tower, passing through the bustling corridors where other classes were changing. A group of third years passed them, and Eleanor noticed several of them had their wands lit, clearly showing off to friends. The wand lighting charm was so common, so everyday, that older students used it without thinking. Do you think we'll always remember this? Priya asked quietly as they climbed a moving staircase that was cooperating for once. Our first successful spells. Or will they become ordinary, like they are for those third years? Eleanor considered this. Maybe both. Maybe they'll become ordinary to use, but we'll still remember how extraordinary they felt the first time. I hope so, Priya said. I don't want magic to stop feeling magical just because I get used to it. They reached the fat lady's portrait, gave the password, and climbed through into the common room. It was mostly empty at this hour. Students were either in classes or enjoying the unusual warm weather outside. Eleanor and Priya claimed their favorite chairs near the window, and Eleanor pulled out her charms notes to review them while the lesson was still fresh. She reread Professor Flitwick's words about intent, about working with magic rather than against it. She thought about how different professors emphasized different aspects of magic: Sprout's patience, Hagrid's respect, McGonagall's precision, Flitwick's joy and partnership. They were all teaching her different ways to approach the magical world. Eleanor held her wand and cast Lumos again, watching the light bloom. Then she tried adjusting the intensity, making it dimmer, then brighter, testing the limits of her control. The magic responded smoothly, eagerly, as though her wand was pleased to be performing this service. Nox, she whispered, and darkness returned. Outside the window, the ground stretched out in afternoon sunlight. Students were visible as small figures near the lake, some studying, some playing. The forbidden forest rose dark against the blue sky, and beyond that, mountains marked the horizon. Eleanor thought about how much she'd learned in less than 2 weeks at Hogwarts. How to care for a magical plant, how to approach a hippogriff with proper respect, how to transform a match into a needle, how to create light from nothing but will and word and wand. But more than the specific skills, she was learning how to be a witch, how to see the world with attention and care, how to approach magic with respect and partnership, how to find joy in both the complexity and the simplicity of spell work. She was learning what kind of witch she wanted to become. And sitting there in the warm common room, her wand in her hand, and the taste of successful magic still sweet in her mouth, Eleanor thought that perhaps, just perhaps, she was beginning to understand what Hogwarts truly meant when it welcomed students home. This castle, with its moving staircases and talking portraits and dedicated professors, wasn't just teaching her magic. It was teaching her how to live with magic, how to exist in a world where extraordinary things were possible, where care and attention and clear intent could transform the ordinary into the remarkable. She smiled, tucked her wand safely away, and opened her charms textbook to begin researching practical applications of the wand lighting charm. Outside, the autumn day continued its slow arc toward evening, and within the castle, a first-year Gryffindor practiced magic with wonder, still intact, ready for whatever lessons tomorrow would bring. Friday morning arrived cool and grey, the unseasonable warmth of the previous day giving way to proper autumn weather. When Eleanor looked out the dormitory window, she could see mist clinging to the grounds, obscuring the lake, and making the forbidden forest appear even more mysterious than usual. The castle itself seemed to huddle inward, its torches burning brighter in the dimness, its stones radiating a subtle warmth that kept the chill at bay. "Potions today," Priya said from her bed, her voice carrying a note of apprehension. "Double potions, in the dungeons." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten slightly. Potions was the one class she'd been simultaneously looking forward to and dreading. The idea of brewing magical concoctions fascinated her. The precision of it, the way ingredients combined to create effects that seemed impossible. But potions was taught by Professor Snape, and even in less than 2 weeks at Hogwarts, Eleanor had heard enough about him to be nervous. He was strict, the older student said, demanding. He favored Slytherins. He was their head of house after all, and was notoriously hard on Gryffindors. He had impossibly high standards and little patience for mistakes. Some students spoke of him with grudging respect, others with barely concealed fear. "At least we're with Slytherins rather than Hufflepuffs," offered Sarah, another first-year Gryffindor who was pulling on her robes. "My brother said Snape goes easier when he's teaching his own house. Maybe he'll be less terrible. Or maybe he'll be worse, because he'll expect more," Priya countered pessimistically. Eleanor dressed carefully, making sure her robes were neat and her tie properly knotted. If Professor Snape was as exacting as everyone said, she didn't want to give him any reason to single her out for criticism. She gathered her things, the brand new copy of Magical Drafts and Potions by Arsenius Jigger that still smelled of fresh ink, her files and scales, a notebook for taking careful notes. The journey down to the dungeons was literally that. Down. They descended staircase after staircase, going deeper into the castle until the air grew noticeably cooler and the torchlight cast long, wavering shadows on stone walls. The dungeons had a different atmosphere than the rest of Hogwarts, where the upper floors felt magical and whimsical, full of moving portraits and enchanted suits of armor. The dungeons felt older, more serious, almost oppressive. "It's cold down here," Priya muttered, pulling her robes tighter around herself. The potions classroom door was heavy wood, reinforced with iron, and it stood slightly ajar, revealing darkness beyond. Eleanor could smell something even from the corridor, a complex mixture of scents, some pleasant, some decidedly not. Herbs and minerals, smoke, and something acrid that made her nose wrinkle. Students were gathering outside the door, Gryffindors clustering on one side, Slytherins on the other, neither group interacting with the other. The Slytherins looked considerably more confident, Eleanor noticed, as though they owned this space in a way the Gryffindors didn't. At precisely 9 o'clock, the door swung fully open from the inside, revealing a classroom lit by candlelight despite the morning hour. The dungeons had no windows, so torchlight and candles were the only illumination. And framed in the doorway stood Professor Snape. He was tall and thin, dressed in black robes that billowed slightly as he moved. His hair was long and black, falling around a sallow face with a hooked nose and eyes so dark they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When he spoke, his voice was soft but carried perfectly in the stone corridor. "Enter." Quietly, the students filed in, and Eleanor found herself holding her breath slightly, as though afraid to make too much noise. The classroom was cool and shadowy, lined with shelves holding jars of ingredients, some recognizable, many decidedly not. There were pickled things floating in murky liquids, dried plants that looked razor-sharp, powders in every color imaginable. Cauldrons of various sizes hung from hooks on one wall, and the student desks each had a burner built into them for heating potions. "Sit," Professor Snape commanded, moving to the front of the classroom where a large blackboard waited. Gryffindors on the left, Slytherins on the right. One cauldron per student. Eleanor chose a desk near the middle of the left side, Priya sliding into the seat beside her. They retrieved pewter cauldrons from the wall, standard size too, as their supply lists had specified, and set them on their desks. The metal was cold to the touch. Professor Snape stood at the front of the room, his dark eyes scanning the students with an intensity that made Eleanor want to look away. He said nothing for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "You are here to learn the subtle science and exact art of potion making," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow perfectly audible in the quiet room. "As there is little foolish wand-waving here, many of you will hardly believe this is magic. I don't expect you will really understand the beauty of the softly simmering cauldron, with its shimmering fumes, the delicate power of liquids that creep through human veins, bewitching the mind, ensnaring the senses." His words were almost poetic, and Eleanor found herself leaning forward slightly, caught by the unexpected imagery. "I can teach you how to bottle fame, brew glory, even stop a death," Professor Snape continued, his gaze moving across the students' faces. "If you aren't as big a bunch of dunderheads as I usually have to teach." The classroom was utterly silent. Eleanor barely dared breathe. Professor Snape moved to the blackboard and began writing in swift, precise strokes. "Today, you will brew a simple potion for curing boils. It is a basic healing draught that every first year should be capable of producing, assuming you can follow instructions and refrain from adding the wrong ingredients at the wrong time." He turned back to face them. "The instructions are in your textbooks on page 10. The ingredients you will need are in the store cupboard. I will not tell you which ones. Reading comprehension is a crucial skill in potions. If you cannot identify what you need from the instructions, you have no business handling potentially dangerous substances." Eleanor quickly opened her textbook to page 10 and scanned the recipe. Cure for boils. Ingredients: dried nettles, crushed snake fangs, stewed horned slugs, porcupine quills. Method: add dried nettles to the cauldron. Add crushed snake fangs. Heat cauldron. Add horned slugs. Take the cauldron off the fire before adding porcupine quills. Stir clockwise until potion turns pink. She memorized the list quickly, then joined the queue forming at the store cupboard. The Slytherins were already gathering their ingredients with practiced efficiency, clearly more familiar with the dungeon environment than the Gryffindors. The store cupboard was fascinating and slightly overwhelming. Shelves upon shelves of jars and bottles, each labeled in neat script. Eleanor found the dried nettles easily enough, then located the snake fangs in a jar that made her slightly queasy when she looked at them too closely. The horned slugs were in a covered pot and had to be spooned out. They were slimy and grey and smelled faintly of pond water. The porcupine quills were sharp and had to be handled carefully. Back at her desk, Eleanor arranged her ingredients in the order she'd need them. She noticed Professor Snape moving between the desks, observing students as they worked but saying nothing yet. His presence was unnerving. He moved silently despite his billowing robes, appearing beside students without warning. "Begin," he said softly, and the classroom filled with the sound of ingredients being added to cauldrons and burners being lit. Eleanor started carefully, adding the dried nettles to her empty cauldron. They settled at the bottom with a soft rustling sound. Next came the snake fangs. She'd crushed them with her pestle as instructed, reducing them to a coarse powder. She added them to the cauldron and watched them mix with the nettles. "Heat," she murmured to herself, lighting her burner with a whispered incendio, a spell Professor Flitwick had taught them just yesterday. The flame caught immediately, burning blue and steady beneath her cauldron. As the mixture began to warm, Eleanor prepared the horned slugs. According to her textbook, they needed to be stewed, which apparently meant they should be heated separately before being added. She placed them in a small dish and held it carefully over her burner's edge. Around her, other students were at various stages of the brewing process. She could hear the simmering of different cauldrons, the clink of stirring rods, the occasional worried whisper as someone consulted their textbook again. "Miss Ashby." Eleanor jumped slightly at Professor Snape's voice directly behind her. She turned to find him standing there, his dark eyes fixed on her preparation. "Your slugs are stewing adequately," he said, his tone giving no indication whether this was praise or mere observation. "However, you are overheating your cauldron. The nettles and fangs should simmer, not boil. Reduce your flame." "Yes, Professor," Eleanor said quickly, adjusting her burner. The flame decreased to a gentler heat, and the vigorous bubbling in her cauldron subsided to a steadier simmer. Professor Snape had already moved on, pausing at another student's desk. "Mr. Finnegan, why are you adding porcupine quills while your cauldron is still on the flame? Did you not read the instructions?" The Gryffindor boy, Seamus, Eleanor remembered, looked panicked. You thought incorrectly. Remove your cauldron from the fire immediately before." There was a sharp hissing sound, and Seamus's potion erupted in a fountain of angry green sparks. Students near him yelped and scrambled back as the potion splattered across his desk, eating small holes in the wood where it landed. "It explodes," Professor Snape finished calmly. With a flick of his wand, he vanished the dangerous mess and repaired the damaged desk. 5 points from Gryffindor for failing to follow explicit instructions. "Clear your cauldron and begin again. This time, read carefully." Seamus's face was flushed with embarrassment and what looked like anger, but he said nothing, just began gathering new ingredients. Eleanor returned her attention to her own potion, determined not to make a similar mistake. Her slugs were adequately stewed now, so she added them carefully to her cauldron. They sank into the mixture with a soft plop, and the potion began to turn a murky grey-green colour. The crucial part was coming: the porcupine quills. She had to remove the cauldron from the flame before adding them, or the potion would become unstable. Eleanor carefully lifted her cauldron off the burner, using the thick cloth provided for that purpose, and set it on the heat-resistant mat on her desk. She counted to 10, letting the potion cool slightly, then added the porcupine quills one at a time. Each quill sank into the mixture with a tiny hiss, releasing small bubbles. The potion's color began to shift, the murky grey-green lightening gradually. "Stir clockwise until it turns pink," Eleanor murmured, picking up her stirring rod. She began to stir, keeping the motion smooth and steady. The potion responded, swirling in her cauldron, its color continuing to change. Grey-green to pale green, to greenish-yellow too. Pink. A soft, delicate pink that reminded Eleanor of rose petals. She stopped stirring and sat back, hardly daring to believe she'd succeeded. Her potion looked exactly like the illustration in her textbook. The right color, the right consistency, gently steaming but not bubbling. "Adequate," came Professor Snape's voice, and Eleanor looked up to find him examining her cauldron. He produced a small glass vial from his robes and used a ladle to collect a sample of her potion. He held it up to the candlelight, studying it critically. "The color is correct. The consistency is acceptable." The smell he wafted the steam toward his face with one hand indicates you did not overheat the nettles. This potion would function as intended. Eleanor felt a warm glow of pride, which lasted approximately 3 seconds before Professor Snape added, "However, your stirring was uneven. Notice the slight cloudiness. That indicates inconsistent integration of ingredients. Stir with more precision next time." He set the file on his desk, for grading later, Eleanor assumed, and moved on to examine other students' work. "That was good though, wasn't it?" Priya whispered from beside her. Her own potion was pink, but noticeably darker than Eleanor's, almost magenta. "He basically said yours worked, but it wasn't perfect," Eleanor said, studying her potion's slight cloudiness now that Snape had pointed it out. "He was right. It wasn't completely clear. I should have stirred more carefully." "You're as bad as the Ravenclaws," Priya muttered, but she was smiling. Taking criticism from Snape and deciding you need to do better rather than just being relieved he didn't take points. The lesson continued, with Professor Snape collecting samples from each student and offering critiques that range from grudging acceptance to scathing dismissal. He took 3 points from Gryffindor when another student's potion turned orange instead of pink, and awarded 5 points to Slytherin when a blonde girl produced what he called a textbook-perfect example of adequate first-year work. By the time the lesson ended, Eleanor's head was full of information about ingredient properties, heating times, the importance of stirring techniques, and the many ways potions could go wrong. Her hands smelled of horned slugs, despite multiple washings, and her robes had a few small splash marks from her potion. "Homework," Professor Snape announced as students began to pack their things, "is to write 12 inches on the healing properties of the 5 ingredients used in today's potion. I expect detailed research, not merely copying from your textbooks. Due Monday." The students filed out of the dungeon classroom and the atmosphere immediately lightened once they were in the corridor. It was like stepping from shadow into light, though the corridor was hardly bright. "That was intense," Priya said as they climbed the stairs back toward the main floors. "I mean, we didn't explode anything, so I guess it went well. But Snape is demanding," Eleanor supplied. "But fair, I think. He criticized everyone, not just Gryffindors. And he actually explained what was wrong, not just that it was wrong." "You would find the positive side," Priya said, but there was no real complaint in her voice. "I suppose you're right, though. At least he's teaching us properly. Some teachers might just tell us we failed without explaining why." They emerged into the entrance hall, where the grey morning light filtering through the high windows seemed bright after the dungeon's darkness. Students were streaming past, heading to their next classes or toward the great hall for an early lunch. Eleanor found herself thinking about the potions lesson as they walked. It had been so different from her other classes. There was no warmth like Professor Sprout's greenhouse, no enthusiasm like Hagrid's creature lessons, no joy like Professor Flitwick's charms, no stern encouragement like Professor McGonagall's Transfiguration. Instead, potions demanded precision and attention in a different way. Clinical, exact, unforgiving of carelessness. But there had been something compelling about it nonetheless. The way ingredients combined to create something new, the careful measurements and timing, the need for absolute focus and control. It was magic without wands, magic that lived in the careful combination of natural substances and the methodical application of heat and stirring and timing. "I think I liked it," Eleanor said slowly, surprising herself. Priya looked at her incredulously. "Liked it? You liked being in a cold dungeon with Snape criticizing everything?" "Not that part," Eleanor clarified, "but the potions themselves. The way everything has to be exact. The way you can see the magic happening as ingredients combine. It's like cooking, but with rules that really matter. If you do it right, you create something that can heal people or help them. That's important." "You're strange," Priya informed her, but she was grinning. "But I suppose that's why we're friends. You find ways to appreciate things that would just frustrate me." They had several hours before their next class. Astronomy wasn't until midnight, which still felt bizarre to Eleanor, even after 2 weeks at Hogwarts. She and Priya decided to use the time in the library, working on their various assignments. The library was becoming one of Eleanor's favorite places in the castle. It was vast and quiet, filled with the comforting smell of old books and parchment. Madame Pince maintained strict silence, but Eleanor didn't mind. She found the quiet conducive to concentration. She settled at a table near the potions section and pulled out fresh parchment to begin her homework. Professor Snape wanted 12 inches on the healing properties of 5 ingredients: dried nettles, crushed snake fangs, stewed horned slugs, porcupine quills, and Eleanor checked her textbook. The recipe also included a base of water, which presumably counted as an ingredient. She started with the nettles, pulling several reference books from the shelves. Magical plants and their properties had a detailed section on nettles, explaining their use in reducing inflammation and soothing skin irritations. Advanced potion making discussed how drying nettles concentrated their healing essence. She took careful notes, making sure to use her own words rather than copying directly from the sources. The work was engaging in its own way, piecing together information from multiple sources, understanding not just what ingredients did, but why they worked. Snake fangs, she learned, had powerful antibacterial properties when properly prepared. Horned slugs produced a mucus that helped skin regenerate. Porcupine quills contained compounds that drew toxins out of wounds. Eleanor wrote steadily, her quill scratching across parchment, occasionally pausing to consult another book or verify a fact. Around her, other students were similarly absorbed in their work. A group of Ravenclaws at the next table were having a whispered debate about Transfiguration theory. A solitary Hufflepuff was copying notes from an enormous tome that looked older than the castle itself. Time passed in that pleasant way it did when Eleanor was focused on learning something interesting. Before she knew it, she'd written 16 inches, more than required, and had a comprehensive understanding of why the cure for boils worked the way it did. "Finished?" Priya asked, looking up from her own work. She'd been researching for herbology, and her parchment was covered in sketches of plants alongside her notes. "Just," Eleanor confirmed, sprinkling sand over her parchment to dry the ink. "You, nearly. I just need to finish this section on gillyweed cultivation." Priya yawned. "I'm exhausted, and we still have astronomy at midnight." "Why is that a class?" "Eleanor, why do we need to look at stars in the middle of the night?" "Because that's when stars are visible," Eleanor suggested reasonably. "You're infuriatingly logical sometimes." They worked a while longer, then headed to dinner when the sun began to set outside the library's windows. The great hall was filling with students, all hungry and tired from their various classes. The enchanted ceiling showed a grey, cloudy sky that promised rain later, perfect weather for staying inside with books and warm fires. Eleanor ate mechanically, her mind still partly on potions. She thought about Professor Snape's criticism of her stirring, about the cloudiness in her otherwise acceptable potion. Next time, she'd stir more evenly, maintaining consistent speed and pressure. She'd pay even closer attention to the timing, to the precise moment when ingredients should be added. Because that was the thing about potions, she realized. It wasn't about natural talent or lucky success. It was about discipline and attention and the willingness to be precise. It was about respecting the process and understanding that shortcuts led to failure, or worse, danger. In a way, it was similar to what all her professors had been teaching her, just expressed differently. Professor Sprout's patient plant care, Hagrid's respectful creature handling, Professor McGonagall's precise transfiguration, Professor Flitwick's intentional charm work. They all require the same fundamental approach. Pay attention, be precise, respect what you're working with, understand the why behind the what. "What are you thinking about?" Priya asked, nudging her. "You've got that look again." "What look?" "The one where you're figuring something out." Your forehead crinkles. Eleanor smiled, just thinking about how all our classes are teaching us the same things in different ways. "There you go again, finding patterns," Priya said, but fondly. "Come on, let's get a few hours of sleep before we have to get up for astronomy." "I don't know how I'm going to stay awake for stargazing when I can barely keep my eyes open now." They made their way back to Gryffindor Tower, navigating the familiar route with increasing confidence. The castle felt different in the evening, quieter, more mysterious, with shadows pooling in corners and portraits dozing in their frames. House elves were already preparing the common rooms for the evening, Eleanor knew, though she'd still never actually seen one. They maintained the fires, fluffed the cushions, ensured everything was warm and welcoming for when students returned from their lessons. The common room was cozy when they arrived, the fire crackling merrily and casting dancing shadows across the red and gold furnishings. A few older students were scattered around, working on homework or playing wizard's chess. Eleanor and Priya claimed their favorite chairs near the window, now showing only darkness and the reflection of the room's warm light. And Eleanor pulled out her potions essay to review it one more time. She read through her careful explanations of ingredient properties, her analysis of how they work together, her conclusions about why precise measurement and timing mattered so much. It was good work, she thought, thorough and clear, and demonstrating genuine understanding rather than just regurgitation of facts. Professor Snape might find something to criticize. He seemed to find fault with everything, but Eleanor was satisfied with her effort. She'd learned something real today, something useful. She could now brew a potion that could help someone, and she understood why it worked. That was magic worth learning. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall against the tower windows, and inside, a first-year Gryffindor sat by the fire with her completed homework, feeling tired and challenged, and strangely content. She'd survived potions with Professor Snape. More than survived, she'd succeeded, at least partially, and she was already thinking about how to do better next time, how to make her next potion even more precise, even closer to perfect. The day wasn't over yet. Astronomy still waited at midnight, but for now, Eleanor allowed herself this moment of quiet satisfaction, this sense of progress and growth. Hogwarts was teaching her to be a witch, one careful lesson at a time, and Eleanor was learning. The tower clock had just chimed 10:30 when Eleanor and Priya returned from astronomy, their robes damp from the light rain and their fingers cold from handling the brass telescopes on the tower's observation deck. Professor Sinistra had kept them later than usual, wanting to ensure everyone could properly identify Jupiter's moons before dismissing them into the wet night. Eleanor's legs ached from climbing all those stairs, up to the astronomy tower, then back down to Gryffindor Tower. But there was a pleasant tiredness to it, the kind that came from a full day of learning and doing. Her bag felt heavier than usual, weighted with completed assignments and notes from a week's worth of magical education. "Password," mumbled the fat lady, who'd clearly been dozing and wasn't pleased to be woken at this hour. "Fortuna, Major," Priya said, stifling a yawn. The portrait swung open, and they climbed through into the common room. Eleanor had expected it to be empty at this late hour, but several students were still scattered around, a pair of seventh years studying by the fire with the intense focus that spoke of NEWTS preparation, a small group of second years playing a subdued game of exploding snap in the corner, and a few others simply sitting quietly, reading or writing letters home. The room itself seemed to welcome them in, the way it always did. The fire in the hearth burned with that perfect, consistent warmth that spoke of house elf magic. Never too hot, never dying down, always exactly right. The flames cast dancing shadows across the crimson and gold furnishings, making the lion emblems on the tapestries seem almost alive. The squashy armchairs near the windows were all occupied, but Eleanor and Priya's favorite spots, two chairs positioned to catch both the firelight and the view were mercifully free. Eleanor sank into her chair with a sigh of relief, dropping her bag beside her. Through the window, she could see very little, just rain streaming down the glass, and occasionally a distant flash of lightning over the forbidden forest. But somehow the darkness outside made the warmth inside feel even more comforting. "I can't believe we've been here 2 weeks," Priya said, curling up in her chair and pulling a blanket from the back of it. The house elves left them there, Eleanor had learned, fresh and perfectly folded, replaced regularly without anyone ever seeing them work. "It feels like longer, like we've always been here." Eleanor considered this. "I know what you mean, but also it feels like we just arrived yesterday. Time is strange here." "Everything's strange here," Priya pointed out. "Strange and wonderful and occasionally terrifying. Did you see Seamus's face when Snape vanished his exploded potion? I thought he might cry." "He was more angry than upset, I think," Eleanor said, remembering the Gryffindor boy's flushed cheeks and clenched jaw. "But Snape wasn't wrong. The instructions were clear about removing the cauldron from the fire first." "Always so fair," Priya teased. "Even about Snape, who definitely has it out for Gryffindors." "I don't think he has it out for anyone specifically," Eleanor said thoughtfully. "I think he just has impossibly high standards and gets frustrated when people don't meet them. Did you notice he criticized the Slytherins too? He told that blonde girl her potion was only adequate, even though he gave her house points for it." "Malfoy," supplied one of the second years from the exploding snap game, apparently listening in. "Draco Malfoy. And yeah, Snape's harsh on everyone, but he's definitely harsher on us. Just wait, you'll see." The second year returned to her game, and Eleanor pulled out her potions essay, wanting to read through it one more time before bed. The parchment crinkled slightly as she unrolled it, and she noticed a small smudge of ink near the bottom, where her hand had rested while writing. The imperfection bothered her more than it should. Everything else about the essay was neat and precise, but that one smudge marked it as less than perfect. "Are you seriously reading your homework again?" Priya asked incredulously. "Eleanor, you've checked it 3 times already." "It's good. It's better than good. It's probably the best essay in the class." "There's a smudge," Eleanor said, pointing to it. "There's always going to be something," Priya said gently. "At some point, you have to accept that good enough is actually good enough." Eleanor knew her friend was right, but she couldn't help the perfectionist streak that had emerged over the past 2 weeks. Every class revealed how much there was to learn, how much she didn't know yet, how much further she had to go before she could truly call herself a witch. And if she wasn't constantly improving, constantly striving for better, how would she ever close that gap? She carefully rolled up the essay and tucked it back into her bag. Priya was watching her with an expression that was part amusement, part concern. "You know," Priya said carefully, "you're allowed to just enjoy this. Being here, learning magic, you don't have to be perfect at everything immediately." "I'm not trying to be perfect," Eleanor protested. "I just want to do well." "There's doing well, and then there's whatever this is." Priya gestured at Eleanor's overstuffed bag, at the notes that covered every inch of parchment in tiny, precise handwriting, at the way Eleanor had already pulled out her Transfiguration textbook to review for Monday's lesson, even though it was nearly 11 at night. "You're going to burn yourself out," Eleanor opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. Was Priya right? She thought about the past 2 weeks. The constant studying, the meticulous note-taking, the way she visited the library every free period to research beyond what was required. She'd thought she was simply being diligent, simply taking her education seriously. But maybe there was a line between dedication and obsession, and maybe she'd crossed it without noticing. I just don't want to fall behind, Eleanor said quietly. Everyone else seems to understand things so quickly, and I feel like I have to work twice as hard to keep up. Are you joking? Priya sat up straighter, looking genuinely surprised. Eleanor, you're near the top of our year in practically everything. You got Lumos working before almost anyone else. Your match-to-needle transformation is the most consistent in Transfiguration. Even Snape said your potion was adequate, which from him is practically effusive praise. You're not behind. You're ahead of most of us. Eleanor blinked, genuinely surprised by this assessment. She'd been so focused on her own perceived shortcomings. The cloudiness in her potion, the slight curve in her needle, the way her seedling's third leaf was smaller than she'd like, that she hadn't really considered how her progress compared to others. But there's still so much I don't know, she said. Of course there is, Priya agreed. We've been here 2 weeks. We're first years. We're supposed to not know things. That's why we're here, to learn. And you are learning, faster than most. You just need to also let yourself enjoy it. The fire crackled pleasantly, and someone's owl hooted softly from the direction of the dormitories. Eleanor let Priya's words sink in, feeling something tight in her chest begin to loosen slightly. When did you get so wise? Eleanor asked, attempting lightness. I've always been wise, Priya informed her loftily. You've just been too busy studying to notice. Then her expression softened. Seriously though, Eleanor. This is Hogwarts. This is the place we dreamed about when we got our letters. Yes, we should work hard and learn as much as we can. But we should also enjoy it. Otherwise, what's the point? Eleanor thought about her week, the satisfaction of watching her seedling grow, the thrill of Silverwing's acceptance, the quiet pride when Professor McGonagall had acknowledged her progress, the joy of creating light with Lumos, even the intense focus required in potions. Those moments had been wonderful, not because of the grades she might receive or the praise from professors, but because they'd been genuinely engaging, genuinely magical. Maybe Priya had a point. Okay, Eleanor said, closing her Transfiguration textbook and setting it aside. No more studying tonight. What should we do instead? Priya's face lit up. Well, there's always... She was interrupted by a huge yawn. Okay, maybe what we should do is sleep. But tomorrow, we're going to do something fun. No homework, no extra research, just exploring or something. Deal, Eleanor agreed, surprised by how good it felt to make that commitment. Though I should still visit the seedling. That's not homework, that's care. That's fine. That's different. Priya stood and stretched. Come on, let's get to bed before we fall asleep in these chairs. I'm so tired I might actually sleep through breakfast, which would be tragic because it's Saturday tomorrow, and they always do the good pastries on Saturdays. They gathered their things and headed toward the spiral staircase that led to the girls' dormitories. As they climbed, Eleanor could hear the common room settling into night behind them, the fire's gentle crackle, the soft murmur of the 7th years still studying, the distant hoot of an owl from somewhere in the castle. The dormitory was dark when they entered, their 3 roommates already asleep behind their bed curtains. Eleanor changed into her nightclothes as quietly as possible, then slipped into her 4-poster bed and drew the curtains around her. The fabric enclosed her in a small, private space that felt safe and warm. She lay back against her pillows, also house elf maintained, she knew now, always perfectly fluffed and at exactly the right temperature, and let herself simply exist for a moment without thinking about assignments or spells, or whether she was doing well enough. Through a gap in her curtains, she could see the window across the dormitory. Rain was still falling steadily, and occasional lightning illuminated the grounds in brief, dramatic flashes. Thunder rumbled distantly, a deep sound that she could feel as much as hear. But inside the tower, inside her bed, with its warming charms and heavy curtains, Eleanor felt perfectly safe and comfortable. She thought about the day, potions in the cold dungeons, the careful precision required, the way Professor Snape had acknowledged her adequate work even while pointing out its flaws. She thought about astronomy on the rain-slicked tower, identifying Jupiter's moons through breaks in the clouds, while Professor Sinistra explained their orbital patterns. She thought about all her classes this week, each one teaching her different aspects of magic, different ways of seeing and interacting with the world. But more than the specific lessons, Eleanor thought about what she was learning about herself. She was capable of this, of magic, of growth, of adapting to a completely new world. She'd worried before coming to Hogwarts that she wouldn't measure up, that she'd be exposed as somehow not magical enough, not smart enough, not enough. But she was measuring up. She was learning and growing and succeeding. Maybe she needed to trust that more, trust herself more. Eleanor reached over to her bedside table and touched her wand. Ashwood, unicorn hair, 11 inches. It was cool beneath her fingers, but immediately began to warm, responding to her touch. On impulse, she pointed it upward and whispered, "Lumos." Light bloomed at the tip, soft and warm, casting a gentle glow across the inside of her curtained enclosure. She'd created this light, from nothing. Just 2 days ago, she hadn't known how. Now it came as easily as breathing. "Nox," she murmured, and darkness returned. But the darkness wasn't frightening or oppressive. It was comfortable, peaceful, the natural darkness of night that promised rest and renewal. Eleanor set her wand back on the bedside table and burrowed deeper into her blankets. Outside, the storm continued its gentle assault on the castle walls. Inside, students slept or studied or quietly enjoyed the warmth and safety of their house common rooms. And in a tower dormitory, a first-year Gryffindor who'd been working too hard allowed herself to simply rest, knowing that tomorrow would bring new lessons, new challenges, new opportunities to learn and grow. She thought about her Mimblelus Mimbletonia seedling in the greenhouse, growing slowly but surely under her and Priya's care. She thought about Silverwing in her paddock, the magnificent hippogriff who'd accepted Eleanor's respect and offered trust in return. She thought about her partially transformed match that was becoming more needle-like with each attempt. She thought about her pink potion that had worked even if it wasn't perfect. These were her accomplishments, her growth, her magic taking root and beginning to flourish. And perhaps Priya was right. Perhaps she needed to not only work hard, but also appreciate what she was achieving, enjoy the process rather than constantly focusing on what she hadn't mastered yet. Eleanor's eyes were growing heavy, sleep creeping over her like a warm tide. Her last conscious thought was of the castle itself, ancient Hogwarts with its moving staircases and talking portraits, and patient professors with its house elves maintaining perfect fires, and its grounds full of magical creatures, with its library full of knowledge and its classrooms full of possibility. This was her home now, at least for the school year. This was where she belonged, not because she was perfect or had proven herself completely, but simply because she was here, learning and growing, working hard, but also she would try harder at this, enjoying the extraordinary gift of magical education. The rain drummed steadily against the tower windows. Thunder rumbled like a distant giant turning in his sleep. And Eleanor Ashby, first-year Gryffindor student at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, drifted into peaceful sleep with a small smile on her face. Tomorrow was Saturday. Tomorrow there would be no classes, no strict schedules, just time to explore and rest and enjoy being exactly where she was. Tomorrow she would visit her seedling, perhaps walk down to see Silverwing, maybe practice her transfiguration or charms just because she wanted to, not because she felt she had to. Tomorrow she would try to find the balance Priya had suggested between dedication and joy, between striving for improvement and appreciating current achievement, between working toward who she wanted to become and enjoying who she was right now. But tonight, she would simply sleep. The dormitory was quiet except for the gentle sounds of breathing from her roommates, the soft patter of rain, the distant rumble of thunder. The house elves' fire in the common room below continued burning perfectly, its warmth rising through the tower, keeping the stone walls comfortable even on this wet autumn night. And somewhere in the depths of her dreamless sleep, Eleanor's magic, still young and growing, still finding its shape and strength, settled more deeply into her being, becoming not something she did, but something she was. A witch, a student, a girl learning to see the world through magical eyes and finding it more wonderful than she'd ever imagined. The castle kept its watch through the night, ancient stones weathering yet another storm, as they had weathered thousands before. Within its walls, hundreds of students slept, each one dreaming their own dreams, each one growing in their own way, each one learning what it meant to be magical. And in the morning, when sunlight broke through the departing clouds and illuminated the grounds in fresh, clean light, they would all wake to another day at Hogwarts, another day of classes and friendship, of challenges and discoveries, of ordinary magic and magical ordinariness, blended together in the peculiar way that only this castle, this school, this extraordinary place could achieve. But that was for tomorrow. Tonight, there was only rain and warmth and well-earned rest. Tonight, there was only peace. Eleanor slept deeply and well, cradled by Hogwarts itself, surrounded by magic in every stone and timber, protected and welcomed, and exactly where she belonged. The first 2 weeks of her magical education were complete. So many more stretched ahead, full of lessons yet to learn and magic yet to discover. But she was ready. She was home.